Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we journey into the violent heart of New York's underworld to meet a man so feared, even killers spoke his name with caution. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the ruthless underboss of the Lucchese crime family, a man who ruled with blood, paranoia, and terror. He wasn't the face you saw on the front page, but the shadow behind every hit, every betrayal, every whisper that kept New York's Mafia awake at night. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this underworld of ours stretch across time zones, a quiet empire of night owls and storytellers. And if you're new here, don't vanish into the dark just yet. Hit subscribe and join us every night as we uncover the hidden lives, deadly loyalties, and quiet betrayals of history's most dangerous men. Now, take a slow breath, let the noise of the day drift away, and step into the cold, silent mind of Gaspipe Casso, the most feared man in New York. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The Streets of Brooklyn. Under the dim, orange glow of a Brooklyn streetlight, a boy no older than 12 pressed his ear to the world and listened. The neighborhood was alive, but not with laughter. It hummed like a machine built from secrets and smoke. The rumble of Cadillacs, the click of dice on a stoop, the low growl of men whose eyes never smiled. Somewhere in that rhythm, Anthony Casso learned what power sounded like: quiet, steady, and feared. It's hard to say when exactly fear first took root in him. Maybe it was the night he watched his father's knuckles split open a man's lip in a backroom argument over debt. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was in the silence that followed. In Bensonhurst, silence wasn't emptiness. It was survival. You didn't talk too much, didn't ask too many questions, and didn't forget who was watching. Even as a kid, Anthony understood that. He was born in 1942 in a small brick apartment on Bay Ridge Avenue. The world was still at war, but Brooklyn had its own battlefields, corner by corner, block by block, the streets carved into invisible territories. His father, Michael, was a longshoreman by day and a bookmaker by night. The kind of man who could smile at the priest on Sunday and collect from a drunk on Monday without missing a beat. His mother, Mary, was a quiet woman, devout and protective, but even she knew the walls whispered things a mother shouldn't hear. In those days, the Mafia wasn't some distant legend whispered on the news. It was the air itself. Men in suits lingered by butcher shops, nodding to neighbors who owed them favors. Envelopes changed hands faster than greetings. Kids like Anthony grew up watching the local Goodfellas, as if they were movie stars who never needed a script. They were respected, untouchable, and always, somehow, in control. For young Anthony, the streets were a classroom. He learned who to greet with respect, who to avoid, and when to cross the street. There was no school bell to tell him when lessons began. The teachers were the men in silk shirts leaning on Buicks, their lessons written in the way people moved around them, cautious, deferential, afraid. Every neighborhood had its figures of legend. In Bensonhurst, names like Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino floated in conversations the way saints' names might in church. Anthony didn't know them, not personally, but he knew their shadows. They loomed over every store, every card game, every whispered threat. And in those shadows, something inside him began to stir, a hunger, sharp and cold, to be more than just another kid from Bay Ridge. He wasn't a big kid, but he was quick, wiry, and mean when he had to be. His temper flashed fast, like a match head. By the time he was a teenager, people had already started calling him Gaspipe, though no one seems to agree on why. Some said it was because he once beat a kid with a length of pipe in a street fight. Others claimed it was because he carried himself like one, rigid, dangerous, ready to explode. Whatever the truth, the name stuck like the smell of oil on his father's hands. Brooklyn in the 50s was a city inside a city, half American dream, half underworld kingdom. The docks were the heartbeat, pulsing with goods, cash, and crime. Longshoremen unloaded more than crates. They unloaded opportunities. Cigarettes, liquor, silk. If it had value, it had a price, and someone like Michael Casso knew how to move it quietly. The unions were thick with mob influence, and men like Casso's father operated in that gray fog between worker and soldier, between family man and foot soldier of the streets. Anthony saw it all, and he absorbed it the way dry earth drinks rain. He watched how his father never boasted, never bragged, but always got paid. Respect wasn't shouted, it was earned in whispers. In that quiet example, the boy learned something essential. In a world full of noise, silence was power, and it would define him. He'd hang around the neighborhood candy store where older guys played cards in the back. They'd let him fetch cigarettes or sandwiches, sometimes flipping him a dollar bill that smelled like sweat and whiskey. Every errand pulled him a little deeper into their orbit. By 16, he wasn't just running errands, he was running bets. The kid with sharp eyes and sharper instincts was already making money. Still, beneath the ambition, there was something darker. Anthony loved his family, but love in that world came with conditions. His father demanded toughness, his mother begged for goodness, and between them, the boy split in two. On Sunday mornings, he sat in church under the soft glow of stained glass, feeling the quiet weight of his mother's prayers. By Sunday night, he was counting money in the back room of a bar, learning to lie with a straight face. The older men started to notice him. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He wasn't reckless like some of the other neighborhood kids, trying to impress the mobsters. He waited, observed, memorized faces and favors. And that patience, that eerie stillness, made people uneasy. It's how predators move. Not loud, not fast, but deliberate. By the late 50s, the American Mafia was at its peak. The five families had turned New York into a chessboard of rackets and alliances. Politicians were bought, cops were owned, and blood was spilled quietly. For the Cassos, this was the water they swam in. And Anthony, barely out of high school, was already paddling toward deeper, darker currents. One summer night, he stood outside a social club on 86th Street, watching men twice his age laugh over cigars. Their cars lined the curb, Cadillacs, Buicks, all shining like black mirrors. He noticed how people stepped aside when those men walked by. That invisible line of respect fascinated him. Power didn't need noise. It bent the air around it. And standing there, he wanted it more than anything he'd ever wanted before. The following week, one of those men, a Lucchese associate named Christopher Fernari, called him inside. It was the moment every street kid dreamed of and feared. Fernari was polite but sharp, a man who could make you feel safe while deciding whether you should disappear. He told Anthony he'd been watching him, said he had the right kind of silence. That phrase stuck with him forever, the right kind of silence. It started small, deliveries, collections, messages that couldn't be trusted to anyone else. But in those quiet errands, Anthony found his rhythm. The thrill wasn't in the violence. It was in the precision. He knew when to knock, when to keep his mouth shut, when to disappear. He became the ghost every crew needed, always present, rarely seen. There's a saying in Brooklyn, you don't find the life finds you. For Anthony Casso, it wasn't a choice so much as gravity. Every time he tried to imagine another path, a clean job, a simple life, the streets pulled him back. The smell of cigar smoke, the jingle of coins, the low murmur of respect. It was intoxicating. He started dressing sharper, talking less, and thinking long-term. Most young guys wanted fast money and faster fame. Casso wanted structure, control, the invisible strings that made men dance. By 20, he was earning real money in gambling and loan sharking operations. The old-timers liked his loyalty, his cold discipline. The young guys feared him because he didn't play. But under the surface, there was still that boy from Bay Ridge, watching, learning, calculating. He saw how easily fortunes shifted. One wrong word could end a man. One careless glance could be misread as disrespect. He understood that survival in this world was like walking a tightrope strung between loyalty and death. You couldn't stumble. You couldn't blink. Sometimes, at night, he'd walk home alone through the narrow streets, past the bakeries and row houses. The city lights shimmered on rain-soaked asphalt. He'd think about his father, still working the docks, still keeping the family afloat in his own quiet way. There was admiration there, but also something colder, resentment. Anthony didn't just want to survive the system his father served. He wanted to own it. By the early 60s, the mob world around him was shifting. The FBI was growing bolder, surveillance more sophisticated. The old guard was being replaced by men who were younger, hungrier, and meaner. Casso fit that new generation perfectly. Ruthless efficiency dressed in calm precision. And yet, for all the blood that would one day follow his name, there was something hauntingly human about his beginnings. He wasn't born a monster. He was born into a place where monsters were made. One handshake, one favor, one silent nod at a time. One evening, he sat on his apartment's fire escape, staring at the skyline beyond the rooftops. The city looked endless, glowing like molten steel. He thought about how men like him rose, not with noise, but with patience, waiting for others to destroy themselves first. He didn't know it yet, but that philosophy would one day make him one of the deadliest men in Mafia history. A passing car rolled by below, slow and deliberate. The driver glanced up for half a second, met his eyes, then drove off. It was nothing, and yet, in that world, nothing was ever just nothing. Every look meant something. Every silence carried weight. Anthony Casso exhaled into the night, the sound swallowed by the hum of Brooklyn. Somewhere out there, his future was already waiting. A future built on fear, loyalty, and betrayal. The kind of future that doesn't knock. It just walks in. And as the shadows stretched across the rooftops of Bensonhurst, the boy who listened to whispers on the streetlight's edge began to fade into the silence he would one day command. The streets had chosen him, and in return, he would give them everything: his soul, his name, and eventually his mercy. But mercy, as New York would soon learn, was something Anthony Casso never truly believed in. The night was quiet now. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like the breath before a scream. Because somewhere in that darkness, a man was about to make his first kill. And the streets of Brooklyn would never sleep the same again. Chapter 2. Baptized into the mob. The first time Anthony Casso saw a man die, it didn't shock him. It fascinated him. He remembered the sound before the silence, the echo of gunfire bouncing off brick walls, the way people froze for a moment before pretending nothing happened. In Brooklyn, pretending was survival. The cops would come, ask questions no one wanted to answer, and the blood would be gone by morning, washed into the gutters like it never existed. But Anthony remembered. He remembered how quiet it got afterward. That silence was power. That silence was the world he was stepping into. By the time he was 17, the streets had already marked him as one of their own. He wasn't the loud kid anymore, cracking jokes and chasing girls. He turned into something else. Calm, alert, with eyes that noticed everything. The men at the candy store stopped calling him kid and started calling him Tony. It was a small change, but to him, it felt like a coronation. He'd earned it. Every errand, every favor, every quiet act of loyalty had built him a reputation. The kind that made people lower their voices when he walked by. His mentor, Christopher Christie Tick Furnari, saw something in him. A steadiness, a cold discipline rare in someone so young. Furnari wasn't a street brawler or a showman. He was a strategist, a consigliere in the making. He ran operations for the Lucchese family out of a social club on Carroll Street. From that dim, smoke-stained room, he controlled millions, gambling, loans, unions, drugs. It wasn't about muscle. It was about understanding people, about pressure and timing. Anthony absorbed those lessons like scripture. The initiation into the mob wasn't a ceremony you signed up for. It was a slow burn, a test of endurance. First came errands, picking up cash envelopes, delivering coded messages, running bets across boroughs. Then came collections, where politeness and menace danced together. You learned how to talk to a man who owed money. Not too soft, not too hard. You gave him a chance to save face. Respect was currency. But if he crossed the line, you reminded him whose money he was holding. Anthony proved himself quickly. He had a way of reading people, their fears, their weaknesses, the cracks in their pride. He could stand in a room full of men twice his age and never flinch. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make threats. His stillness was enough. It unnerved people. And in that world, making others uneasy was a skill worth more than a gun. The Lucchese family was one of the 5 families ruling New York's underworld, a silent empire carved from blood and business. They controlled the garment district, the docks, construction, trucking, every trade where cash could be skimmed or pockets could be lined. To the outside world, they were invisible. To the city, they were arteries pumping money beneath the surface. Casso's father had always skirted those edges, working the docks under mob-controlled unions. Now his son was crossing the line completely. Fernari paired him with older associates, men like Peter, Fat Pete, Chiodo, and Frank Lastarino, to teach him the ropes. Their lessons weren't in words, but in moments. You learned how to keep your mouth shut when cops came around. You learned how to lie without blinking. You learned when to act like you didn't know someone you saw every day. The code wasn't written, but it was absolute. Family before friends. Silence before honesty. Loyalty before everything. One cold night, Fernari called him into the club. The place smelled like coffee, gun oil, and fear. The 3 constants of mob life. Fernari was sitting with a few other men, all older, all watching him. "You've been doing good," Fernari said quietly, tapping ash from a cigarette. "But out here, good don't mean safe. You understand that." Anthony nodded. "I need to know you can handle yourself." There was no warning after that. One of the men stood, grabbed him by the shirt, and punched him square in the jaw. Anthony stumbled, but didn't go down. He just stared back, breathing slow, eyes hard. The man swung again. This time, Anthony ducked, came up fast, and hit him in the throat. The man fell gasping. Silence filled the room. Then Fernari smiled. A thin, dangerous smile. "You'll do fine," he said. That was his baptism. Not with blood, but with violence accepted as normal. From that night on, Anthony wasn't running errands anymore. He was earning. Fernari trusted him with collections, loan sharking, and gambling operations across Brooklyn. He learned how to squeeze money out of men without spilling blood. At least, not right away. When someone refused to pay, Anthony didn't shout or break fingers. He'd visit the man's wife instead, ask about her kids, compliment her house. Then he'd turn to leave, stopping just long enough to say, "It'd be a shame if something happened to this place." He never had to come back twice. His reputation spread fast. People said he was cold, mechanical, like a machine built for fear. But to those who knew him, there was still something human underneath. He loved his mother deeply, brought her groceries, kissed her cheek before heading out each night. She begged him to leave that life behind, but he'd just smile softly. "Ma," he'd say, "I'm fine. You worry too much." She could see the darkness in his eyes even then. A mother always knows. By 21, Anthony was making more money than most men twice his age. He drove a sleek black car, wore suits that fit like armor, and carried himself like someone who didn't need to prove anything. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. Every dollar earned came with eyes watching, waiting. Every handshake carried an unspoken threat. The mob wasn't a fraternity, it was a web. And once you were caught in it, you couldn't get out without tearing yourself apart. The Lucchese family ran on hierarchy. Bosses, underbosses, capos, soldiers, associates. Anthony was still an associate, but he was already being noticed by higher-ups like Anthony, Tony Ducks Corallo, the boss himself. Corallo was old school, measured, intelligent, and deadly in his patience. He liked Casso's efficiency. He liked that the kid didn't talk too much. In a world built on whispers, silence was a luxury. Then came his first killing. Not a random act, not a burst of rage, but a calculated decision. A low-level earner had been skimming money, stealing from the wrong people. Fernari gave the order, and Anthony volunteered. It was his initiation into the real business, the one where loyalty was proven in blood. They caught the man one night outside a bar in Brooklyn. The streetlights were dim, and the air smelled like rain. The man pleaded, but Anthony didn't hesitate. One pull of the trigger, and the street went quiet. He felt no guilt, no triumph, only calm. It wasn't pleasure, it was precision. The silence afterward was familiar. It reminded him of his childhood, the stillness after chaos. That moment changed him, not because he enjoyed it, but because he understood it. In that world, death wasn't cruelty. It was order. A message written in gunpowder. Betrayal had a price. As the 60s moved on, Anthony's influence grew. He became Fernari's right hand, handling business with other families, smoothing disputes, collecting debts, and quietly eliminating problems. He wasn't loud like John Gotti, who craved the spotlight. He was the opposite. Invisible, efficient, always 3 steps ahead. People started calling him the Ghost. It wasn't a nickname he asked for, but he didn't mind. The mob was changing. Drugs were flooding the streets, bringing easy money, but also unwanted attention. The old bosses wanted control, but the younger soldiers wanted cash. Casso saw both sides and navigated between them like a surgeon. He understood that the future belonged to those who could adapt, those who could be ruthless without losing control. He started working closely with a man who would become his partner in both power and destruction, Vittorio Vic Amuso. They were opposites in some ways. Amuso was impulsive, loud, quick to anger. Casso was quiet, calculating, the one who planned before pulling the trigger. But together, they were lethal. They rose through the ranks like a storm gathering over New York's skyline. The Lucchese family became their training ground, and Brooklyn their empire. Every corner, every union, every racket was a piece of a larger puzzle, one they were already rearranging in secret. The bosses didn't see it yet, but the future was being rewritten in silence. At home, Anthony's life remained carefully compartmentalized. To his neighbors, he was polite, generous even. He attended family gatherings, kissed babies, sent flowers to funerals. He smiled often, but never laughed too loudly. It was as if he carried 2 versions of himself, one that belonged to his mother's kitchen, and another that belonged to the streets. And every day, that second version grew stronger, colder, more defined. By the mid-60s, the FBI had started paying attention. Agents followed cars, tapped phones, wrote reports filled with half-truths and guesses. But Anthony was too smart for that. He spoke in code, avoided names, used silence as camouflage. He learned from older men how to survive under surveillance. Never go the same route twice. Never meet in the same place. Never trust anyone fully. He was 25 when Fernari told him, "You're ready." It wasn't about skill anymore. It was about loyalty. The next step was the one that couldn't be undone, becoming a made man. The ceremony was quiet, secret, held in a basement beneath a restaurant in the Bronx. Only a handful of men were present. The St. Card was burned in his hands as he swore the oath, to the family, to silence, to death if he betrayed it. "This blood," Fernari said, "is the life you chose. Remember, you can't wash it off." Anthony looked at the flame, felt the heat bite his skin, and smiled faintly. He didn't flinch. That night, the boy from Bensonhurst died, and Gaspipe Casso was born. Afterward, they all went upstairs, drank wine, and toasted to his future. But even in that moment of celebration, Anthony stayed quiet. He understood something the others didn't, that this wasn't a victory. It was a contract written in blood, binding him to a world where every friend could one day be an enemy, and every decision could be his last. In the years that followed, Casso became one of the most feared men in Brooklyn, not because he was the loudest or the cruelest, but because he was unpredictable. He could sit across from a man, drink coffee with him, talk about family, and then, the next day, that man would vanish. There was no rage, no theatrics, just cold efficiency. He once told an associate, "You don't need to yell to be dangerous. The quiet ones were the ones you should be scared of." And he meant it. The streets whispered his name the way people whisper prayers, softly, reverently, with fear. Still, beneath the armor, a small part of him longed for something ordinary. A family. A life without eyes on him. But that life was already gone. He traded it for power, for the kind of control that came with blood on your hands and silence in your soul. By the time the 70s arrived, Anthony Gaspipe Casso was no longer just another soldier. He was a name that made men pause mid-sentence, a name that carried both promise and threat. And as Brooklyn slept under the hum of streetlights and distant sirens, Casso stood at the edge of the world he'd built, one foot in loyalty, the other in darkness. He thought he could control it, but even he didn't know that the silence he mastered would one day turn on him. That in the end, it wouldn't be a bullet or betrayal that destroyed him, but the very stillness he once worshipped. For now, though, the streets belonged to him. The city pulsed beneath his feet, and the underworld whispered his name. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, a signal exchanged, a life about to end. Gaspipe didn't look back. He never did. He walked into the night, the sound of his footsteps fading into the same silence that had followed him since childhood. The silence of a man baptized not by faith, but by fear. Chapter 3. The Lucchese Family Machine. The hum of the city was different now. It wasn't the restless rhythm of childhood or the reckless noise of ambition. It was the low, measured pulse of power. Anthony Gaspipe Casso had found his place inside the machine, and the Lucchese family was that machine. It moved quietly, efficiently, with gears made of greed and loyalty. On the surface, New York glittered with opportunity, but beneath the sidewalks, men like Casso were turning the cogs that made the city run. He had grown into the kind of man people didn't argue with, not because he shouted, but because he didn't have to. He could end a conversation with a glance, shift a man's loyalty with a nod. In the early 1970s, the Lucchese family was one of the most stable of the five families. Its boss, Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo, had transformed it from a street crew into a corporate empire. Construction, unions, trucking, drugs, and gambling, all of it fed into the same quiet river of money flowing back to the top. Casso thrived in that world. He had patience, and patience in a mob was gold. He understood timing, when to act, when to wait, when to disappear. He moved up fast under the protection of Christopher Fernari, his mentor, and earned a reputation as the man who could get things done without drawing heat. But even in an empire built on silence, Casso stood out. There was a sharpness to him, an edge that even other killers could sense. He didn't crave violence, but he respected its necessity. Violence, to him, was a language, a punctuation mark in a sentence only a few could read. The Lucchese family wasn't loud like the Gambinos, who flaunted their wealth and walked with movie star swagger. They didn't make headlines like the Colombos or spill blood as recklessly as the Bananos. The Luccheses were subtle. They preferred order, efficiency, and strategy. They didn't just run rackets, they ran systems. Corallo used his connections in unions and city contracts like a chess player arranging his board. The game wasn't to win today. It was to control the next 10 moves. And Casso was learning every rule, every loophole, every unspoken law. He spent his days in Brooklyn and his nights in Manhattan, sitting in back rooms where fortunes were decided over espresso and cigarettes. To outsiders, it looked like casual conversation. But every word mattered. Every pause meant something. You didn't interrupt the boss. You didn't fidget. You didn't look at your watch. Casso learned to read silence like scripture. And in that silence, he started seeing patterns. Who owed who was loyal, who was weak. He filed every detail away. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Fernari kept him close, and soon Casso was handling delicate matters that others wouldn't touch. There were construction disputes, stolen truckloads, missing payments. Each problem was a test, and he passed them all. He didn't just settle disputes, he managed outcomes. A union leader who tried to play both sides suddenly found his car on fire. A gambler who tried to short the family woke up with a broken hand and a note that simply read, "No second chances." The message was always clear: but never dramatic. That was the Lucchese way. Control without chaos. The family's influence stretched deep into the city's infrastructure. Trucking companies, garment factories, cement suppliers, all paid tribute. On paper, they were legitimate businesses. In reality, they were extensions of the family's will. Casso became the quiet enforcer behind these operations. If someone delayed payment or forgot their place, he'd appear, calm, polite, terrifying. He rarely needed to pull a trigger anymore. His reputation did it for him. Fear, after all, was more efficient than bullets. He learned that the mob wasn't just about crime, it was about management. Each family was like a corporation with its own departments, budgets, and politics. The boss was the CEO, the underboss the vice president, the capos middle management, and soldiers the labor force. Associates, like Casso once was, were freelancers trying to earn a permanent seat at the table. But unlike a corporation, failure here wasn't measured in losses, it was measured in funerals. Casso's intelligence made him invaluable, but intelligence in that world was a double-edged sword. It made him useful to the bosses, but dangerous to his peers. Some men started whispering about him, saying he was too cold, too ambitious, too unpredictable. They weren't wrong. He didn't play cards much anymore. He didn't hang around just to joke or drink. He was always working, always watching. That made people nervous. In the mob, fear kept you alive, but too much of it could get you killed. Then came the unions. The Luccheses had long controlled the garment district, but by the mid-70s, they were expanding into construction and transportation. The Teamsters, the carpenters, the electricians, each union was a gold mine. You didn't have to steal money when you could control the contracts. A single handshake could shift millions. Casso became a key player in these deals. He sat across from developers and union heads who smiled too much, who thought they were in charge. He'd let them talk, let them feel comfortable, and then lean in just enough for them to understand who they were really dealing with. He once told a friend, "You can hit a man and he might forgive you, but if you take away his sleep, you own him." That was his philosophy, control through fear, but fear delivered softly. Casso's name began to carry weight outside the boroughs. Other families started to recognize him as the man behind the Lucchese family's rising power. He wasn't a boss yet, not even close, but his presence was felt everywhere. When disputes arose between families, over territory, over money, over blood, Casso was often the one sent to negotiate or to end them. His ability to blend diplomacy with menace made him indispensable. But the higher he climbed, the darker things became. The FBI was tightening its grip on the Mafia Commission, the ruling body of bosses that governed the five families. Wiretaps were everywhere. Informants were popping up like weeds. Trust, already scarce, became almost extinct. Inside the Lucchese family, alliances shifted like sand. One wrong word could destroy a lifetime of loyalty. And Casso, for all his intelligence, wasn't immune to the paranoia that defined that era. He kept his circle small, just a handful of men he trusted, including his emerging ally, Vittorio Amuso. Amuso was different from Casso. He had fire where Casso had ice. Together, they made a balance of chaos and calculation. They began working on joint ventures, drug routes through the Bronx, gambling operations in Queens, extortion rackets that spanned all five boroughs. It was business as usual, but it was also a quiet revolution. The younger generation was coming, and the old bosses didn't see it yet. Casso started making moves that weren't sanctioned, testing boundaries. A dealer who refused to pay tribute ended up buried in a landfill. A lone shark who went independent disappeared. Each move was precise, methodical, and efficient. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was rewriting them. Fernari saw it happening and warned him, but Casso couldn't stop. Power was an addiction, and he'd had his first taste. By the late 70s, Tony Duck's Corralo was aging. The FBI's investigations were closing in, and the old ways of doing business were dying. Meetings became smaller, conversations shorter, trust thinner. The bosses didn't gather in restaurants anymore. They met in cars, in parks, in whispers. Casso adapted effortlessly. He thrived in secrecy. The less people knew, the stronger he became. He understood that the mob's golden era, the one his father had revered, was ending. The days of handshake deals and open respect were gone. Now, it was about survival. Technology was changing the game. The FBI had bugs, wiretaps, satellites. But Casso had something they couldn't record: instinct. He knew when to vanish, when to change his phone, when to kill a rumor before it killed him. He lived in two worlds now: the old-school loyalty of the Luccheses and the ruthless modern pragmatism that would define the new generation of mobsters. His rise was inevitable, but it came at a cost. His humanity began to erode. He still saw his mother, still kissed her cheek, still told her not to worry, but the warmth in his eyes was gone. The streets had taken it. Every life he ended, every lie he told, stripped away another piece of the boy who once listened to whispers under a streetlight. There were nights when he'd drive through Brooklyn alone, past the docks where his father once worked, past the old candy store that started it all. The city looked smaller now, more fragile. He wondered if it was changing or if he was. He thought about the men who tried to warn him, the ones who said that life always ends in two ways: prison or death. But then he'd think of the power he had, the fear he commanded, and he'd smile. Maybe he'd be different. Maybe he'd be the one who broke the rule. In the early 80s, when Corallo was arrested and sent to prison, the Lucchese family began to shift. Fernari took on more responsibility. Capos jockeyed for position. And in the background, Casso and Amuso were quietly consolidating power. They built alliances through favors and fear. If someone opposed them, they vanished. If someone supported them, they were rewarded. It was politics with a body count. The Lucchese family machine was changing gears, and at its heart stood a man who understood exactly how every cog turned. Casso wasn't just part of the machine anymore. He was becoming the one who oiled it, tuned it, and decided when it was time for a gear to be removed. But even machines break down. And in a world built on secrecy, betrayal wasn't a question of if, but when. Casso's rise had been quiet, methodical, almost surgical. But the higher he climbed, the more he realized that the view from the top came with no cover. Everyone could see you. Everyone wanted what you had. One night, he met with Amuso in a darkened lot near the docks. The wind carried the smell of salt and rust. "You ever think it'll all end?" Amuso asked, lighting a cigarette. Casso didn't answer right away. He looked out at the water, the faint glow of Manhattan in the distance. "Everything ends," he said finally, "but not before we decide who goes first." It was the kind of answer only a man like him could give, cold, final, drenched in quiet conviction. And somewhere in the shadows of that night, the seeds of the Lucchese family's most violent era began to sprout. Anthony Casso had mastered the machine, but soon he would try to take control of it entirely. The silence that once protected him would become the very thing that betrayed him. For now, though, the city slept under his watch. The machine hummed smoothly. The money flowed. The bodies disappeared quietly. And in the stillness of Brooklyn's night, Anthony Gaspipe Casso stood at the edge of power, unaware that every empire, no matter how well-oiled, eventually grinds itself to dust. Chapter 4. The Deadly Duo, Casso and Amuso. The first time Anthony Gaspipe Casso looked Vittorio Vic Amuso in the eyes, there was no handshake, no formal introduction, just a silent acknowledgement between two predators who knew they were cut from the same cloth. It happened in a dimly lit club in Brooklyn, the kind of place where deals were made with nods and lies were ended with whispers. Both men were soldiers then, still clawing their way up the ranks of the Lucchese family. But even in that first meeting, there was an unspoken electricity between them. Not friendship exactly, but something more dangerous, a mutual recognition of ambition and ruthlessness wrapped in quiet restraint. Amuso was built like a brick wall, with eyes that never softened, not even when he smiled. He had a temper that burned quick and bright, the kind that could turn a conversation into a killing in seconds. Casso, by contrast, was the ice to Amuso's fire, measured, deliberate, capable of waiting days or weeks before making a move. Together, they were balance. One was chaos, the other was calculation. And when those two forces met, the Lucchese family would never be the same again. In the early 1980s, the old guard was fading. Bosses were dying, getting locked up, or growing too cautious to survive the new Mafia landscape. Federal prosecutors were sharpening their knives, building cases under the new RICO laws that could take down entire crime families at once. The streets were shifting, drug money was flooding the neighborhoods, alliances were cracking, and loyalty was being sold cheap. In that chaos, Casso and Amuso saw opportunity. They started small, running joint rackets in Brooklyn, bookmaking, construction kickbacks, and drug shipments that ran through the docks and into New Jersey. What set them apart wasn't just the money they made, but the efficiency with which they made it. There were no loose ends, no unnecessary risks, no leaks. Casso handled logistics, Amuso handled enforcement. If someone stepped out of line, Amuso's rage took care of it. If someone needed to vanish without a trace, Casso planned it. They were methodical, almost surgical. It didn't take long before everyone in the family knew that crossing one meant crossing both. Their partnership deepened when the Lucchese hierarchy began to crumble under federal pressure. With boss Anthony, Tony Ducks Corallo, and Consigliere Christopher Fernari both facing indictments, the family needed new blood to keep the streets under control. The old men were smart, but the future belonged to those who could move fast, think sharper, and kill without hesitation. Casso and Amuso fit that mold perfectly. They weren't just loyal soldiers anymore. They were architects of fear. They shared a simple philosophy. Fear was better than respect, because respect could fade, but fear stayed. The two began orchestrating a quiet purge within the Lucchese family, getting rid of weak links, trimming the fat, and replacing hesitation with obedience. It started subtly. A few disappearances here, a few quiet murders there. Associates who got too talkative found themselves missing. Capos who questioned decisions suddenly had accidents. Nobody could prove anything, but everyone knew who was behind it. The irony was that they never talked about it. They didn't need to. A glance, a nod, a single sentence could decide a man's fate. They operated with such precision that even their closest allies rarely knew the full extent of their plans. The other families began to notice. Word spread through the underworld that the Luccheses were changing, that the days of quiet deals were giving way to a new era of ruthless control. Casso and Amuso didn't just rule with violence. They ruled with strategy. They built their empire not only on bodies, but on business. Casso struck deals with the Gambinos, Colombos, and Bananos when it suited him, while Amuso maintained a strict, almost militaristic discipline among their soldiers. They made sure everyone paid tribute on time, that the family's money flowed clean and constant. Every dollar that moved through Brooklyn seemed to pass through their hands. But power always brings attention, and attention is poison in the Mafia. The FBI began taking notice of the two names that kept surfacing in their investigations: Casso and Amuso. Surveillance vans followed them through city streets. Cameras clicked from across intersections, and wiretaps filled with half-heard conversations began to pile up in evidence rooms. Yet for all their efforts, law enforcement could never pin them down. Both men spoke in riddles, using nicknames, code words, and silence as weapons. They understood that in a world built on secrecy, words could kill faster than bullets. Behind closed doors, the partnership grew more intense and more paranoid. Amuso's temper flared often, and when it did, it was like watching a storm tear through the streets. Casso, calm as ever, became the only one who could pull him back. "Let me think," he'd say, and Amuso would wait, pacing like a caged lion, until Casso delivered a plan that always seemed to end with someone dead and their problem solved. Together, they made murder feel like administration, cold, clean, necessary. In 1986, when John Gotti and the Gambino family executed their own boss, Paul Castellano, On the streets of Manhattan, everything changed. The commission, the governing council of mafia bosses, was thrown into chaos. The power vacuum spread like a virus, and the streets buzzed with uncertainty. While other families scrambled to figure out where they stood, Casso and Amuso saw it as an opening. If Gotti could take out his boss and seize control of the largest family in New York, why couldn't they do the same? But the Luccheses were more cautious. Corallo was still the boss, though imprisoned, and his words still held weight. He appointed Amuso as acting boss and kept Casso as his right-hand man on the outside. Together, they effectively ran the family from Brooklyn, tightening their grip on rackets, controlling unions, and expanding into drug distribution with unheard-of efficiency. The money poured in, and so did the blood. Casso and Amuso didn't just eliminate threats, they sent messages. When they suspected someone of disloyalty, they didn't always kill them right away. Sometimes they'd let them live just long enough to see their friends disappear first. It was psychological warfare, a slow suffocation that made even the toughest men break. They turned paranoia into policy. Soldiers began looking over their shoulders, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe the wrong way. That's exactly how Casso wanted it. Fear was control. Their most infamous operation began in the late 1980s, a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. Dozens of murders, many unsolved to this day, were ordered under their rule. Some victims were buried in construction sites, others vanished into the ocean, and some simply disappeared between one night and the next. Every time a body turned up, the message was clear: silence wasn't optional. Despite their brutality, they maintained a strange sense of loyalty to each other. They trusted no one else. The bond between them was forged in violence and sharpened by necessity. They become something beyond partners, two sides of the same blade. Even within the family, they were seen as untouchable, a pair of ghosts moving in sync. But power that burns too fast always consumes itself. Their paranoia grew as the FBI tightened its grip. Informants were everywhere, and the walls were closing in. One by one, old associates flipped, trading loyalty for leniency. The Mafia's sacred code of silence, omerta, was breaking apart. Casso and Amuso responded the only way they knew how, by killing anyone who even looked suspicious. What started as a campaign of control turned into a storm of blood. They weren't just eliminating enemies anymore. They were erasing entire sections of their own family. Even among mobsters, fear turned to disbelief. Men who'd served the Luccheses for decades vanished without explanation. The safe streets of Brooklyn became hunting grounds, and whispers filled the backrooms. "No one's safe," someone murmured once, and everyone knew it was true. Casso and Amuso had built their empire on loyalty, but now even loyalty couldn't protect you. The family was devouring itself. Still, the money didn't stop. Construction deals, union contracts, and drug profits kept flowing. For every body that dropped, a new business rose in its place. The irony was almost poetic. The more violent they became, the richer they got. It was as if the city itself rewarded their ruthlessness. Every skyscraper built in Manhattan carried the ghost of someone they'd silenced. There were nights when they'd sit together in silence, staring out at the skyline. Casso would sip coffee, Amuso whiskey. "You ever think we went too far?" Amuso asked once. Casso smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "There's no too far," he said. "There's only too late." It wasn't bravado, it was prophecy. By the early 1990s, they were at their peak. The Lucchese family, once known for its quiet precision, had become one of the most feared organizations in America. Casso was officially underboss, Amuso the boss. They controlled everything from construction to cocaine, their reach stretching from New York to Florida. They had cops on their payroll, politicians in their pockets, and killers on speed dial. They were unstoppable, or so they thought. But cracks were forming. Amuso's volatility started to clash with Casso's calculation. Small disagreements turned into arguments, and arguments into shouting matches behind closed doors. The partnership that had built an empire was starting to fracture. Casso began making independent decisions, hits, deals, alliances, without consulting his boss. He justified it as protection for the family, but deep down, he knew he was protecting himself. The FBI raids became more frequent. Warrants were issued, meetings disrupted. Every time they met, they had to assume it was the last. Still, they refused to stop. They operated like generals in a war they couldn't admit they were losing. Then came the day that would change everything. One of their trusted men, a soldier named Alphonse Darko, decided to flip. He became an informant, feeding the FBI details about the family's operations, its murders, and its leadership. It was the ultimate betrayal. When Casso heard the news, his reaction wasn't rage. It was a calm so cold it frightened even his closest associates. "Then we burn everything," he said, and he meant it. From that point on, paranoia turned to mania. They ordered more murders, chased more ghosts, and dug themselves deeper into a hole they couldn't climb out of. The FBI wasn't just listening now, they were moving in. Their names were on indictments, their photos on wanted posters. The reign of Casso and Amuso was collapsing, not from outside attack, but from the weight of its own fear. Still, for all the chaos, one truth remained. They had rewritten what it meant to be feared in New York. Their legend was carved in silence and blood, their names whispered in prisons and police precincts alike. Even the men who hunted them admitted a strange kind of awe. They had turned violence into an art form, loyalty into a weapon, and fear into currency. But the city never forgets, and power never forgives. Somewhere, in the fading neon light of a Brooklyn night, Anthony Casso and Vic Amuso, once the deadliest duo in the Mafia, stood on the edge of their own undoing. The empire they'd built so carefully was about to crumble. The night stretched long and quiet. The streets, for once, didn't hum, they waited. Somewhere far away, a phone rang. Orders were given. Men began to move. The machine was turning again, but this time, it wasn't grinding enemies. It was coming for its own creators. And as Casso looked out over the city that had made him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He'd seen enough men rise and fall to know the truth. No one stays untouchable forever. Not even Gaspipe. Not even the man who made silence his empire. The streets of New York were quiet that night. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before everything changes. Chapter 5. Blood on the Streets. It began with a scream that no one heard. Brooklyn in the early 1980s was the kind of place where the sound of a gunshot was just another crack in the city's rhythm, where blood could soak the concrete and life went on. Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso knew that silence well. He had grown up in it, mastered it, and now, as underboss of the Lucchese family, he was using it as his deadliest weapon. Fear had become his language, and death was how he spoke it. The war for power inside New York's underworld was reaching a fever pitch. The old codes of honor that once defined the Mafia were fading into myth, replaced by greed, betrayal, and survival. The commission had fractured. John Gotti's flamboyant rule over the Gambinos had drawn headlines and heat, and the Luccheses, under Casso and his partner, Vic Amuso, were caught between wanting that same dominance and dreading the attention it brought. It was in that chaos that the blood began to flow. Casso never believed in making examples out of people publicly. He believed in making them vanish. When a man disappeared, everyone filled in the blanks themselves, and imagination, he knew, was more terrifying than truth. He once told an associate that killing someone wasn't the point. It's the waiting that gets them. He would let his enemies linger for weeks, wondering if the next car that slowed beside them was the last one they'd ever see. That was his form of torture, fear stretched over time like wire across the throat. The first major hit came when a Lucchese soldier named Bruno Facciolo was suspected of talking to law enforcement. He wasn't just killed, he was destroyed. Casso wanted a message sent, not just to the man, but to the city. They found Facciolo's body stuffed in the trunk of his own car, a dead canary placed in his mouth, a grotesque symbol for a snitch. The sight of it made even hardened killers sick. Casso didn't flinch. He looked at the photo later and said quietly, "Good. Now they'll remember." Fear spread faster than bullets. Soldiers who once bragged about their kills now watched their words carefully, terrified that one wrong sentence would mark them next. The streets whispered that Casso didn't need a reason to kill you, just a suspicion. And suspicions were endless. Every man under him walked a tightrope stretched over a pit of paranoia. Even loyalty was dangerous. Too much of it made you look like a threat. He used the city like a chessboard. Each neighborhood was a piece, each capo a pawn, each murder a move. His control was total, but it came with a price. The blood that bought his power began to stain everything it touched. Casso's paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, not even a muso. Every conversation was layered, coded, analyzed afterward for signs of betrayal. Sleep came rarely. Even at home, in the quiet of his Staten Island house, he'd lie awake with a pistol on the nightstand, convinced the shadows were moving. A muso, for his part, was unraveling faster. His temper, once a tool, had become a liability. The two men began feeding off each other's darkness. Casso's suspicion fueled Amuso's rage, and Amuso's rage justified Casso's suspicion. Their leadership became a storm, unpredictable and merciless. The Lucchese family, once known for precision and order, was now a battlefield of ghosts. It was around this time that Casso began reaching beyond his own family for control. The streets of Brooklyn were shared by many, and alliances were currency. He started dealing directly with corrupt law enforcement, two detectives from the NYPD's organized crime unit who would become infamous later, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa. They were cops, sworn to uphold the law, but for Casso, they were assets. He paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars for information: who was talking, who was being watched, where the bugs were planted. They even carried out hits for him, using their badges as shields. With them on his payroll, Casso believed he was untouchable. But power always invites paranoia. In his world, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He began setting traps for his own men, leaking false rumors, watching who repeated them. When someone did, they disappeared. A missing soldier here, a vanished associate there. Each time it happened, the circle around him grew smaller, tighter, colder. The family was eating itself alive, but Casso saw it as purification. "The weak die first," he told a muso once. "That's how you keep the blood clean." Every night, Brooklyn seemed to breathe differently. The bars, the social clubs, the diners, they all carried an invisible weight, the sense that anyone could be next. The line between loyalty and fear blurred until it no longer existed. Men greeted each other with forced smiles, hugged too long, lingered too close, trying to gauge whether they were being marked for death. Casso didn't just command fear. He studied it. He learned how it changed people, how their eyes shifted, how their voices cracked when they lied. He once sat across from a man suspected of stealing, listening quietly as the man swore his innocence. Casso didn't interrupt. He just stared, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity. When the man finally broke and confessed, Casso nodded softly and said, "I knew it. You blinked." Then he ordered him buried in a foundation of wet cement before the concrete trucks arrived that morning. His methods were brutal, but they worked. The family grew rich under his control. Construction contracts poured in, union deals were enforced without resistance, and drug profits soared. The fear he created kept everyone efficient. The money came in like clockwork, and as long as it did, the bloodshed didn't seem to matter. But every machine, no matter how well-oiled, grinds down eventually. In 1990, the FBI finally caught up to Amuso. He was indicted on racketeering and murder charges and forced to go on the run. Casso stayed behind, running the family in his absence, claiming he was keeping the streets under control. But truthfully, he was consolidating power. Without Amuso's fiery temper beside him, he became something colder, more calculating, more lethal. Brooklyn belonged to him now. The hits escalated. Anyone suspected of supporting Amuso over him was wiped out. Associates who whispered too loudly about Casso's growing ambitions found themselves face down in alleyways or stuffed into car trunks. He wasn't just cleaning house. He was building a new one, brick by brick, body by body. Casso's arrogance grew with every kill. He began talking about himself in the third person, referring to Gaspipe like he was a legend separate from a man. To some, he already was. To others, he was a curse, a reminder that death was no longer the last punishment, only the most visible one. He started living like a man who believed he couldn't die. The luxury houses, the tailored suits, the expensive dinners, they weren't vanity, they were armor. He thought that if he looked untouchable, he would be. But the FBI had been watching. The very detectives he paid for protection were beginning to attract suspicion. Investigators started connecting the dots. Too many murders, too many coincidences. The walls around Casso's empire were closing in. Still, he didn't stop. If anything, he doubled down. When rumors surfaced that a Lucchese capo named Peter Fat Pete Kyoto might cooperate with authorities, Casso ordered him killed. Kyoto was shot 13 times outside his car in Staten Island, but somehow survived. It was a miracle and a disaster. The moment Casso heard he was still alive, he ordered the next hit. Not on Kyoto, but on his wife and sister. That broke every rule the Mafia had ever lived by. Families were supposed to be sacred, off-limits. But to Casso, rules were for weaker men. When Kyoto heard that his wife had been targeted, he did the unthinkable. He flipped. He became one of the government's star witnesses. That betrayal marked the beginning of the end. Casso didn't know it yet, but the same fear he'd built his empire on was about to consume him. The streets that once obeyed him now whispered against him. The men who once swore loyalty were feeding the FBI everything they knew. The walls of silence he'd built began to crack, and through those cracks, the truth poured in. Casso went into hiding in late 1991. He had everything: money, fake IDs, connections, but no one left he could trust. The very detectives who had protected him were now liabilities. Every knock on the door, every car that slowed outside his safe house, sent a chill through him. The hunter had become the hunted. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life mastering silence, only to be trapped by it. Every secret he kept was now a potential noose around his neck. Every man he'd killed had a friend waiting for revenge. He still had money, but money meant nothing when you couldn't buy trust. One night, sitting in the dark of a safe house in New Jersey, he looked out the window and saw his reflection. Older, heavier, his eyes hollow. For the first time, he wondered if this was what power really looked like. Not glory, not strength, just a man alone in a room, afraid of his own footsteps. But fear had never stopped him before. He still believed he could fight his way out. He began plotting revenge, on a muso, on the FBI, on anyone he thought had turned against him. It was delusion disguised as strategy. The empire he had built from blood was now built entirely from ghosts. In February 1993, his luck ran out. After 2 years on the run, the FBI caught up to him in a small house in Mount Olive, New Jersey. He was arrested without resistance. When agents let him out in handcuffs, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. He wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. At the time of his arrest, Casso was accused of ordering more than 50 murders. He bragged later that the real number was over 100. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the fear that followed his name. Gaspipe Casso had turned New York into his hunting ground, and the echoes of his violence would haunt the city long after his reign ended. Inside the FBI offices that night, one agent looked at him and said, "You've caused more death than any man we've ever brought in." Casso smiled faintly, as if it were a compliment. "You should thank me," he said. "I cleaned up your streets." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that had always surrounded him. But this time it wasn't power. It was defeat. The machine he'd built from fear had finally turned on its maker. Still, even as the cell door clanged shut behind him, Anthony Gaspipe, Casso wasn't done playing. He had one last weapon left, his words. He began to talk. Names, deals, murders, secrets. For the first time in his life, silence wasn't power, it was prison. And as his words echoed through FBI hallways and courtroom corridors, the blood he'd spilled on the streets of New York began to rise to the surface again. Every ghost he thought he'd buried came crawling back into the light. The streets he once ruled with iron calm now whispered a different story, of betrayal, of vengeance, of the man who thought he could outlive the fear he created. Somewhere in the city, under another dim orange streetlight, another young man was listening, watching, learning the same lessons Casso once did. History, after all, has a way of repeating itself in the dark. The blood on the streets had dried, but the stains would never fade. And Anthony Casso, sitting alone in his cell, finally understood what every king of the underworld learns too late. Power isn't what you take. It's what's left behind when you're gone. The city exhaled quietly, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of ghosts waiting for the next Gaspipe to be born. Chapter 6. The Commission and the War for Control. The year was 1986, and New York was holding its breath. The city was alive with tension, neon lights, sirens, whispers in backrooms. The Commission, the invisible government of the American Mafia, was breaking apart piece by piece. The old men who had once ruled from the shadows were dying, imprisoned, or turning on each other. Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso could feel it. Power was shifting. The rules that once kept the five families balanced were crumbling, and in that chaos, new monsters were being born. He intended to be one of them. Casso had always understood one truth. Power wasn't given, it was taken. The Commission had been designed to prevent the kind of all-out wars that tore apart Chicago or Sicily. It was supposed to keep the bosses in check, to maintain order. But order meant predictability, and predictability was weakness. John Gotti had just proven that when he orchestrated the murder of his own boss, Paul Castellano, on a cold December night in front of Sparks Steakhouse, the hit sent shockwaves through the underworld. The message was clear. If a soldier had the nerve, even kings could bleed. Casso watched the headlines, watched the chaos unfold, and saw opportunity. He and Vicamuzzo were rising fast within the Lucchese family. Their boss, Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, was a relic of an older time, smart, cautious, traditional. But the FBI had been tightening its noose around him and his inner circle for years, building the famous commission case that would soon bring him down. When Corallo was arrested and later convicted in 1986, the Lucchese throne was suddenly empty. The question wasn't just who would take it, it was who had the courage to survive it. Casso and Amuzzo had already begun maneuvering long before the sentence was read. Their alliance was built not on friendship, but on shared ambition. They were two predators circling the same kill, understanding that cooperation, for now, meant survival. Casso, the underboss in waiting, handled the strategy. Amuzzo, hot-tempered and impulsive, brought the muscle. Together, they were untouchable. Or at least, that's what they believed. The Lucchese family was no small operation. It controlled construction unions, trucking companies, waste management, and gambling rings that stretched from New York to Florida. Money poured in like a tide, and everyone wanted a piece. But with Corallo gone, the sharks began circling. Capos who had stayed quiet under his leadership suddenly wanted more. Soldiers whispered about new alliances. Old grudges resurfaced. The family was cracking from within, and if Casso and Amuzzo didn't seize control fast, someone else would. The first step was eliminating doubt. Casso began calling private meetings with key captains, reminding them where their loyalties lay. There were promises of power, threats of death, often in the same breath. He spoke softly, but his eyes said everything. One by one, the capos fell in line. Some out of loyalty, most out of fear. Those who didn't disappeared. By the time Amuzzo was officially named boss, the streets were already running red. Casso became his underboss, but in truth, he was the mind behind the throne. Their partnership was lethal. Amuzzo gave orders. Casso interpreted them, improved them, made them efficient. Together, They turned the Lucchese family into a machine of precision terror. The commission itself was falling apart. The Gambinos, under Gotti's flashy leadership, were drawing too much attention. The Colombos were torn by internal war. The Bananos were barely surviving the fallout from years of infiltration. Only the Genovese family still held to its quiet, calculating traditions. Casso admired that about them. In another life, he might have fit there, structured, strategic, patient, but now he was building something darker. Under his guidance, the Luccheses expanded aggressively. They took over contracts in Manhattan's garment district, seized control of labor unions, and forced construction companies to pay tribute just to keep their projects moving. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about domination. Casso wanted the Luccheses feared not just in New York, but across the country. He once told a lieutenant, "Respect fades. Fear sticks to the skin." They also started dealing heavily in drugs, despite the old Mafia rule against it. Cocaine and heroin were flooding the streets, and Casso knew that fighting it was pointless. If the money existed, someone would take it. Better it be them. He used his connections with corrupt cops and drug traffickers to build a network that funneled millions through the family's coffers. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it worked. For a time, they were untouchable. But with power came paranoia. Every success made them more visible, and visibility in the Mafia was death. The FBI was always watching. The commission trial had changed everything. It proved that no one, not even the bosses, was safe from prosecution. Casso began operating from the shadows, using layers of intermediaries, secret safe houses, and coded messages. He stopped using phones, stopped trusting anyone outside his immediate circle. Even among killers, he had become an island. The war for control wasn't just within the Luccheses. It stretched across all 5 families. Tensions flared between the Luccheses and the Gambinos after Gotti's reckless rise to power. Casso despised Gotti's arrogance. He saw him as a showman, a man who craved attention in a world that survived on silence. When Gotti's men killed Frank DeCicco, a high-ranking Lucchese associate, Casso took it personally. He swore revenge. "I'll put him in the ground myself," he said. He meant it. Plans were drawn, contracts whispered. At one point, Casso even tried to hire a hit team to kill Gotti using a car bomb, the same method that had killed DeCicco. The bomb went off, but Gotti escaped. It was the beginning of a feud that would last for years. Meanwhile, within his own family, Casso's iron grip began to choke the very people who worked for him. He and Amuso launched what would later be called the Lucchese Purge. Dozens of suspected traitors, thieves, and even longtime associates were executed. Some were shot in the back of the head, others disappeared entirely. It didn't matter if the suspicion was true. If there was even a whisper of disloyalty, that was enough. Casso once said, "Better 10 wrong than 1 rat left breathing." The killings were relentless. Soldiers who had served the family for decades vanished overnight. Their wives waited for phone calls that never came. The fear was suffocating. Men began to dread being summoned to meetings, knowing they might not come home. It wasn't just business anymore. It was paranoia turned policy. But while his enemies were dying, Casso's paranoia was keeping him alive. He had made enemies everywhere. Inside the family, across other families, even within law enforcement. He started traveling with an armed convoy, switching cars every few miles. He had safe houses across Brooklyn and Staten Island, each stocked with weapons, cash, and false identities. He trusted no one completely, not even Amuso. And yet, the two of them needed each other. Amuso's authority gave Casso legitimacy. Casso's brutality kept Amuso in power. They were bound together by necessity, and that bond was soaked in blood. It was around this time that Casso's most infamous alliance took shape, the one with the Mafia cops, detectives Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. Through them, he gained access to information that no mobster had ever possessed before: surveillance schedules, informant identities, even the location of witnesses in protective custody. They became his secret weapon, turning law enforcement into his personal intelligence network. When someone betrayed him, He didn't have to guess who. It was all handed to him, neatly wrapped in an NYPD report. This access gave him godlike control, but it also fed his delusions. He began to believe he was invincible. When one of his enemies, Eddie Leno, a Gambino captain and associate of John Gotti, became a problem, Casso ordered the Mafia cops to handle it. They pulled Leno over on a fake traffic stop and shot him dead in his car. No witnesses, no noise, just another silent erasure from the streets of New York. The message was unmistakable. Even the powerful could vanish in daylight. But the cracks were deepening. The more power Casso grabbed, the more isolated he became. Amuso's trust was wavering. He began to suspect Casso of plotting behind his back, of building alliances that might one day turn against him. He wasn't entirely wrong. Casso had begun making quiet deals of his own, managing money through offshore accounts, building escape plans for when the inevitable fall came. He'd seen what happened to men who thought they were untouchable. He wasn't going to end up like them. Yet fate doesn't ask permission. In 1991, the FBI raided one of his safe houses. They seized ledgers, phones, cash, proof that the Lucchese family was operating as a criminal corporation. The heat became unbearable. One by one, his allies were arrested or turned informant. Amuso fled New York, going on the run for more than a year before being captured in Pennsylvania. For the first time, Casso was alone at the top. The war for control was over. He had won, but there was no one left to rule. The commission, once the heartbeat of the Mafia, was now little more than a rumor. The remaining bosses were either in hiding or behind bars. The old order was dead, and the new one, Casso's order, was bleeding out before it could even take shape. He tried to keep it alive, issuing orders from the shadows, still using his network of corrupt cops to stay ahead of the law. But the circle was closing. The FBI had wiretaps, informants, and years of evidence stacked against him. His name was on every indictment, his fingerprints on every crime. Even his own men were whispering about making deals to save themselves. When Casso finally went on the run, it wasn't an escape, it was an exile. The man who once controlled New York's underworld was now moving through it like a ghost, jumping from one safe house to another, hunted by both the law and his own creation. He had once believed silence was power, but now that silence was all that was left. The war for control had consumed everything: his allies, his enemies, his family, and his soul. The commission was gone, replaced by chaos. The Mafia itself was fracturing, turning from an empire of rules into a scattered network of desperate survivors. And at the center of that collapse was Anthony Casso, the man who had wanted to be a god and ended up a fugitive. Late one night, hiding in a darkened house in New Jersey, he listened to the rain tapping against the window. He thought of the men he'd killed, the friends he'd betrayed, the empire he'd built from blood. It had all led here, to a single room, a loaded gun, and the sound of footsteps outside. He raised a weapon, heart steady, eyes cold. The silence that had once protected him was gone. Now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. For a long moment, he wondered if this was how all kings fell. Not with a gunfight or a betrayal, but with the slow realization that power was never real to begin with. It was borrowed, fleeting, as fragile as the men who believed in it. Outside, the footsteps stopped. He waited, breathing quietly, hand trembling just slightly. But no one came through the door. Only the sound of rain. He lowered the gun, but the question lingered, heavy as the storm outside. If the commission had once been the heart of the Mafia, what was he now? The last beat, or the final silence? The war for control was over, but in its ashes, a darker truth emerged. Power doesn't die with the men who hold it. It just waits, patient as the night, for someone else to pick it up. And as Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso stared into the darkness, the city that had made him seem to whisper back, promising that the silence he loved so much would one day consume him completely. Chapter 7. The Reign of Terror. The night Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso took full control of the Lucchese family, Brooklyn felt colder than usual. the kind of cold that wasn't just in the air but in the bones of the city itself. He sat alone in a parked car outside a social club on Carroll Street, the engine idling softly, his breath fogging the window. He wasn't celebrating. Power, he knew, didn't come with champagne. It came with corpses. And by the time his reign ended, there would be more bodies buried in New York's soil than anyone could count. He had become the underboss officially, but in truth, he was the man behind every decision, every dollar, every death. Vic Amuso, his partner and now boss, was a figurehead living on borrowed time. Casso didn't need to sit at the head of the table. He controlled it from the shadows, pulling the strings of a family built on fear. The Luccheses had become something new under him. Not a business, not even an organization, but an organism. It breathed when he breathed. It killed when he ordered it. It was alive, ruthless, and hungry. The early 1990s were the peak of that hunger. The family had survived the chaos of the commission trials and the wars between the five families. Now, while the others struggled to rebuild, the Luccheses were thriving, financially, territorially, and violently. Construction, trucking, narcotics, loan sharking, extortion. Every racket was under Casso's control. The streets whispered his name like a curse, and even men who'd once prided themselves on not fearing anyone lowered their voices when they spoke of Gaspipe. But power like his comes with paranoia, and paranoia always demands blood. The more Casso ruled, the more he feared betrayal. He saw enemies everywhere, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. He'd learned long ago that it didn't matter whether the threat existed. What mattered was making sure no one even thought about becoming one. And so began the most violent chapter in the history of the Lucchese family, a reign of terror unlike anything New York had ever seen. It started small with whispers. A soldier suspected of pocketing extra cash from a job went missing. A bookmaker who owed too much was found in the trunk of a car with his teeth scattered across the dashboard. Casso's message was simple and effective. Fear me, and you live. Cross me, and you vanish. But as his paranoia deepened, the killings became more personal. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about control. Killing was how he reminded the world he existed. He rarely pulled the trigger himself anymore, but his fingerprints were on everything. He'd call a meeting, pour coffee, talk business in a calm, steady voice, and somewhere in that conversation, a death sentence would be delivered with the ease of a weather report. Take care of it, he'd say, and that was it. No names, no details. The men who carried out his orders didn't need them. They understood perfectly. His partner, Vic Amuso, grew more unpredictable as the pressure from law enforcement mounted. The FBI had wiretaps everywhere, and indictments were piling up. Amuso went on the run, operating through coded messages and intermediaries, while Casso remained in New York, controlling the family like a puppeteer with invisible strings. It was during this period that the family became less of a criminal network and more of a cult of fear. Loyalty was measured in silence, and silence was enforced by death. When he suspected someone of disloyalty, Casso didn't ask questions. He made examples. He'd order a hit, then have the body displayed, just enough for the message to spread. A body found hanging in a warehouse, a corpse dumped in a river, a headstone with no name. These were his calling cards. Men disappeared so often that people stopped asking why. He once told an associate, "If you think someone's thinking about betraying you, you're already too late." That philosophy became his rule. He eliminated anyone who made him uneasy, friends, rivals, even distant acquaintances. The Lucchese family, once known for its discretion, became infamous for its brutality. The other families watched with unease. Even the Genovese and Gambinos, who prided themselves on ruthlessness, avoided crossing him. Nobody wanted a war with Gaspipe. Casso's power didn't come from money or status. It came from fear's ability to rewrite behavior. He could make a man do anything with a single stare. He once summoned a soldier who had missed a payment and asked him calmly, "You believe in God?" The man nodded, confused. Casso smiled faintly and said, "Good. You're going to need him." The man's body was found 3 days later. Even among mobsters, men raised in a culture of death, Casso's reputation was something different. He was methodical, obsessive. He remembered details, birthdays, addresses, favorite bars, and used them like weapons. He knew how to make people feel safe just long enough to forget what kind of man he really was. That was his genius. He didn't rule through constant violence. He ruled through the promise of it. The silence between acts of terror was what kept everyone on edge. Behind the violence, though, was strategy. Casso wasn't killing for sport. He was tightening his grip. He used blood to seal alliances, to silence dissent, to ensure obedience. If someone questioned an order, they vanished. If someone succeeded too much, they vanished too. Success was dangerous under Casso. It drew attention, and attention drew suspicion. The only safe place in his world was under his shadow, and even there, safety was temporary. He also used his two secret weapons, the Mafia cops, Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa, to deadly effect. They were his eyes inside law enforcement, his lifeline in a world where the FBI's reach was expanding daily. With their help, he identified potential informants before they could turn, feeding him names straight from government files. They became his personal Grim Reapers, killing targets under the cover of police badges. The arrangement blurred every boundary between law and crime. Casso wasn't just fighting the system anymore. He was part of it. Through them, he ordered hits with surgical precision. Sometimes it was as simple as a traffic stop that ended in execution. Other times, it was an ambush planned weeks in advance. The Mafia cops provided him with immunity from surprise. When the FBI planned raids, he knew in advance. When someone was being tailed, he had them killed before they could talk. For years, it worked. It was as if he was playing chess with a map of the entire city while everyone else was blindfolded. But all empires built on fear eventually begin to rot from the inside. The same paranoia that had kept Casso alive was now poisoning the family. Men were terrified, yes, but terror doesn't last. It erodes. Soldiers stopped showing up for meetings, capos ignored calls, and the money started drying up. People were still too scared to betray him openly, but quietly, they were already gone. Meanwhile, the FBI's case against the Lucchese family was growing. Informants from other families began talking, small details at first, then names, dates, addresses. Casso's name came up in every story, always accompanied by the same tone of dread. Even law enforcement agents who spent their careers hunting mobsters described him with a mix of hatred and fascination. He wasn't just another criminal. He was an anomaly, a man so addicted to control that he destroyed the very thing he'd built. As pressure mounted, Amuso's leadership cracked completely. From hiding, he grew more paranoid, more erratic. He began ordering murders on pure suspicion, often contradicting Casso's instructions. The two men, once perfectly balanced, now stood at opposite ends of a fault line ready to explode. Casso's calm calculation clashed with Amuso's frantic desperation. For the first time, Casso began to question whether keeping Amuso alive was worth the risk. In the midst of this chaos, the streets themselves began to change. The old neighborhoods of Brooklyn were disappearing, gentrified, or overrun by new criminal players. The code of silence, the sacred omerta, was crumbling. Younger men didn't fear the bosses the way their fathers had. They saw the Mafia as a dying business, not a legacy. To Casso, that shift was unforgivable. He believed fear could last forever if it was deep enough. He would prove it, even if he had to burn his world down. And he did. The number of murders attributed to him and his regime climbed into the dozens, then the hundreds. Friends, rivals, even civilians who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time were caught in the crossfire. One FBI agent later described Casso's reign as a hurricane of death. Inside the family, his word was law. No one dared to question his motives. If he ordered a man dead, that was enough. There were no trials, no explanations, no discussions. Just the quiet understanding that when Gaspipe wanted blood, blood would flow. But behind the cold efficiency, something darker was happening. Casso was losing himself. The lines between power and paranoia, strategy and madness, began to blur. He started sleeping less, eating less, drinking more. He'd sit for hours in dark rooms, staring at nothing, waiting for a phone that might never ring. Every sound became a threat: the creak of a door, the rumble of a car outside, the echo of his own heartbeat. He trusted no one, not even the men who killed for him. He began assigning multiple crews to the same hit, making sure that even the killers didn't survive long enough to talk. It was efficiency taken to the point of insanity. The Mafia had always lived by an unspoken rule: never kill your own unless absolutely necessary. Casso broke that rule, so often it became meaningless. To him, necessity was whatever he decided it to be. He wasn't preserving the Lucchese family anymore. He was preserving himself. The organization had become a reflection of his own fear, cold, silent, and endlessly self-consuming. When Amuso was finally captured in 1991, Casso didn't flinch. He saw it as an opportunity. With Amuso in prison, he could take full control. But the feds were closing in on him too. Wiretaps, witnesses, informants, the web was tightening. Still, he refused to believe it would end. Men like him didn't go quietly. He had built an empire from shadows. He thought he could live forever inside them. But even shadows have limits. The same silence that had made him powerful now isolated him completely. His allies were gone, his soldiers terrified, his empire crumbling. Every call, every meeting, every whisper could be the one that ended him. And deep down, in the quiet moments before dawn, he knew it. The reign of terror he had unleashed across New York had turned full circle. He had ruled through fear, but fear had no loyalty. It only obeyed the moment. And when that moment passed, all that was left was the echo of what once was. One night, sitting in a safe house, he looked at his reflection in the dark window and saw a stranger. His face was heavier, his eyes dull, his skin pale. The man who once ruled with silence now looked like he'd been swallowed by it. He whispered something to himself, a line no one else would ever hear. They'll all talk one day. He was right. Within 2 years, they would. The feds would catch him. The men he'd once commanded would turn. The silence would break, and the world would finally hear the true story of Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso. But for now, in those final years before the fall, his reign remained absolute. A kingdom of fear carved into the streets of New York. The city slept uneasily under his shadow, every corner haunted by his name. The quiet between murders wasn't peace. It was the inhale before the next storm. And in that breathless pause, as the night stretched over Brooklyn and the lights of Manhattan glowed in the distance, Anthony Casso's empire stood at its peak, brilliant, brutal, and doomed. Chapter 8: The War with the Gambinos. The war didn't start with bullets. It started with pride. Pride disguised as loyalty, loyalty tangled with vengeance. In the world Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso lived in, those lines blurred until all that was left was blood. The late 1980s were a time when the Mafia's old codes were unraveling, and nowhere was that collapse more visible than in the silent feud between the Lucchese family and the Gambinos. To most of the city, it was business as usual: men in suits, envelopes changing hands, a few cars that didn't make it home. But behind closed doors, in whispered conversations and smoke-filled rooms, two empires were circling each other like predators waiting for the other to blink. It began with Frank DeCicco. Frank wasn't just another Gambino capo. He was the muscle behind John Gotti's rise, the man who helped orchestrate the murder of Paul Castellano in front of Sparks Steakhouse. When the bomb meant for Castellano went off in December 1985, it didn't just blow a man apart. It blew apart the Mafia's entire hierarchy. The commission, the unspoken council that kept peace among the 5 families, was fractured overnight. Gotti's boldness had rewritten the rules, and Casso watched it all unfold with a mix of awe and contempt. He admired Gotti's nerve but despised his noise. To Casso, power was supposed to move like smoke, not fireworks. Still, the Luccheses had been aligned with Castellano's faction. When Gotti killed him and took over, Every family had to choose sides. The Luccheses didn't forget the insult. And when DeChico was blown up in a car outside a Brooklyn church in 1986, everyone knew it wasn't random. Rumors whispered that it was revenge, retaliation orchestrated with Lucchese hands. Casso didn't admit it, but he didn't deny it either. Silence, after all, was its own confession. The bomb had been meant for Gotti, not DeChico. The plan was simple but brutal. Plant explosives under Gotti's car, wait for the right moment, then vanish before the smoke cleared. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Gotti switched cars at the last minute. The explosion ripped through DeChico instead, killing him instantly and leaving Gotti untouched. It was a failure, but to Casso, even a failed message was still a message. The streets understood what it meant. The Luccheses weren't afraid of the so-called Teflon Don. Casso's hatred for Gotti grew into obsession. He saw him as everything wrong with the Mafia's future. Flashy, careless, addicted to attention. Gotti's tailored suits, his smirk for the cameras, his arrogance in court. All of it infuriated Casso. He believed the Mafia should live in silence, not on magazine covers. Every time Gotti's photo appeared on the front page, Casso muttered the same thing under his breath. He's going to get us all killed. The tension between the two families simmered quietly for years. On the surface, business continued. The Luccheses and Gambinos shared operations in construction and trucking, and money still flowed. But underneath there was bad blood. The Gambinos wanted dominance. The Luccheses wanted respect. Every handshake between capos was a lie. Every smile a disguise for calculation. The Mafia's balance was delicate, and Casso was the kind of man who believed that peace was just the pause before another war. The bomb that killed DeChico was the first real strike, but it wasn't the last. When the FBI started cracking down on the commission, Casso used the chaos to expand his influence. He infiltrated Gambino-controlled unions, took over construction projects they once owned, and began undermining their connections in the garment district. To Gotti, it was theft. To Casso, it was strategy. And strategy, in his world, always came with casualties. He ordered hits on smaller Gambino associates, quiet removals, nothing flashy. Men vanished from bars, warehouses, street corners. No one could prove anything, but everyone knew who was responsible. Gotti retaliated in his own way, leaning on his power in the streets, sending subtle messages through mutual contacts. He wanted Casso to know he wasn't intimidated. But intimidation wasn't Casso's goal. He wanted to humiliate Gotti, to remind him that fear, not fame, ruled the underworld. In 1989, the conflict escalated. A Gambino associate named Edward Lino became a problem. Lino was one of Gotti's trusted men, and Casso suspected he'd been part of a conspiracy to assassinate him. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In Casso's world, suspicion was enough. He reached out to his most dangerous assets, the two NYPD detectives secretly on his payroll, Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa. They were known to the world as decorated cops, but in Casso's eyes, they were angels of death. The plan was simple. The detectives would stage a routine traffic stop, pull Lino over, and handle the rest. No questions, no noise, no witnesses. One night, on a quiet Brooklyn street, they did exactly that. They flashed their badges, waved Lino to the side, and, as he rolled down his window, they shot him twice in the face. The car drifted forward and hit a parked vehicle. Within hours, word spread through the underworld. Lino was dead. Casso didn't even flinch when he heard. He just said, "Good. One less headache." The murder of Edward Lino sent shockwaves through the Gambino family. No one knew exactly who had done it, but everyone felt the message. It wasn't just about one man. It was about power. The Luccheses had reached into Gotti's house and struck one of his own, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. Gotti raged in private, threatening revenge, but he couldn't risk open war. The FBI was already circling him, and another high-profile conflict would only tighten the noose. For Casso, that was victory. He had proven that even the Dapper Don could be touched. But victory, for him, never brought peace. It only made him crave more. The line between self-preservation and self-destruction was thinning, and Casso was walking it with eyes wide open. He started talking about Gotti constantly, even to his own men. "He's loud," he'd say. "Loud men die fast." The hatred became personal. Gotti's image, his smirk, his laughter, his arrogance, became a fixation. Casso wanted him gone, not for business, but for pride. He hired crews, set up ambushes, even considered another bombing. Each plan failed or was abandoned at the last minute. It was as if Gotti carried some cursed luck, and every bullet meant for him found someone else instead. Still, the feud had consequences far beyond the men who started it. Both families suffered. Operations were disrupted, money lost, alliances strained. The smaller families watched from the sidelines, knowing that any imbalance between the two giants could collapse the fragile order of the five families altogether. The FBI, meanwhile, feasted on the chaos. They didn't need to infiltrate. The mob was doing their work for them. Every hit, every disappearance, every feud was another crack in the wall of silence that had protected the Mafia for decades. Casso didn't care. His focus narrowed until the world became black and white. Loyalty and betrayal, friend and enemy. Anyone who questioned his obsession with Gotti became the latter. Even within his own family, whispers began to spread. Some of his capos thought he'd lost perspective, that he was risking too much for a personal vendetta. But none of them dared to say it aloud. They knew what happened to men who tried to reason with Gaspipe. He once told an associate, "You kill one man, you make a statement. You kill 100, you make history." That line captured his entire philosophy. Violence wasn't just a tool. It was identity, reputation, art. The war with the Gambinos wasn't about winning. It was about proving that no one could stand equal to him. But as the killings piled up, Casso began to feel something he hadn't in years: fatigue. Power had made him rich, but not safe, feared, but not fulfilled. He lived surrounded by guards, slept in different houses every week, ate in silence. Even his victories fell hollow. He'd created an empire of death, but every empire eventually eats its own. John Gotti, meanwhile, was facing his own downfall. The FBI had finally caught up with him. Wiretaps, informants, surveillance, his arrogance had caught up with him. In 1992, he was convicted on 13 counts, including murder and racketeering, and sentenced to life in prison. When Casso heard the news, he didn't celebrate. He just smiled faintly and said, "He finally shut up." It wasn't triumph. It was inevitability. But what Casso didn't realize was that Gotti's fall was a mirror for his own. The same arrogance that had brought down the Gambino boss was eating away at him too. The FBI was closing in. His allies were turning. The men he paid to protect him were now liabilities. The same detectives who'd killed for him were leaving a trail of evidence that would lead straight back to his door. The war with the Gambinos had defined his reign, but it also exposed him. The blood spilled between the two families drew attention from every direction: federal, local, even internal. The Luccheses were crumbling under the weight of fear. Soldiers were flipping to save themselves, and every word they spoke led the feds closer to Casso. One night, hiding in a safe house, he turned on the TV and saw old footage of Gotti being led into court, his hair slicked back, his chin high, defiant even in defeat. Casso stared at the screen for a long time. For the first time, he saw himself reflected there, not the power, but the downfall. The silence he'd built his empire on had turned against him. The same city that had once whispered his name now whispered about his capture. The war that had started with pride had ended with emptiness. The Gambinos were broken, the Luccheses bleeding, and the Mafia itself was no longer the kingdom it once was. The commission was gone, the code shattered, the streets crawling with federal agents. There were no more kings, just survivors. And Anthony Casso, the man who once ruled through fear, was now just another fugitive. His war with the Gambinos had made him infamous, but it had also made him visible. For a man who lived in shadows, visibility was death. He closed his eyes that night and listened to the city's hum beyond the window, the sirens, the traffic, the distant echo of laughter. It all felt foreign now, like a language he no longer understood. Power had once made him feel invincible, but now, all he felt was hunted. The feud with the Gambinos hadn't been about money or territory. It had been about ego, legacy, and the illusion of control. And like all illusions, it faded. By the time Casso finally fell, the war was already a ghost story whispered in prison cells and FBI offices. Two men, two empires, both brought down by the same flaw, pride. The city had moved on, but the blood they spilled still soaked its foundations. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over Brooklyn. The rain began to fall, washing the streets clean, at least on the surface. But Casso knew the truth. Blood doesn't wash away. It only sinks deeper. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, the last words he ever spoke about Gotti echoed in his mind. He thought he was untouchable. He didn't need to finish the thought. The irony spoke for itself. Chapter 9. Cops on the Payroll. By the time the 80s gave way to the 90s, Anthony Gaspipe, Casso had already turned fear into a business model. He didn't just control men. He controlled the streets, the unions, and the silence that kept everything stitched together. But even Casso knew that in a city like New York, power had limits. The FBI was getting smarter, the Mafia was bleeding informants, and the old codes that once shielded the five families were collapsing one by one. If he wanted to stay ahead, he'd have to see further, move faster, and know everything before anyone else did. And that's when he found his greatest advantage. Not in another gangster, but in two cops. It started like most things in Casso's world, with whispers. Someone told him there were detectives in the NYPD who could be bought, men who had access to everything. Surveillance files, witness lists, even FBI intel. At first, he didn't believe it. Corruption wasn't new, but cops who worked directly for the Mafia, that was something different. Still, curiosity was Casso's favorite form of risk. He sent out a quiet feeler through an associate, someone who'd worked both sides before. A week later, a name came back. Luis Ippolito. Ippolito came from a police family, decorated and respected. He looked like the kind of man who'd never crossed the line. Thick-necked, clean-cut, proud of the badge on his chest. But looked for just camouflage. Underneath the uniform, Ippolito was as greedy and ruthless as any wise guy on the street. And he wasn't alone. His partner, Stephen Caracappa, was even more dangerous. Quiet, methodical, a man who treated murder like procedure. Together, they were known inside the NYPD as the twins, inseparable, loyal to each other above all else. Casso's first contact came through a middleman who arranged the meeting in a parked car off Avenue X. The story goes that Ippolito slid into the back seat, still wearing his gold detective badge, and asked one question, "What do you need?" Casso studied him for a long moment before answering. "Information," he said, "and protection." He offered money, thousands up front, more to come. The detective nodded. No hesitation. The deal was done before anyone shook hands. From that moment on, Casso owned them. He called them his crystal ball, his way of seeing everything the cops saw before it reached a courtroom. Through them, he knew when the FBI was setting up wiretaps, which cars were being followed, who was cooperating, and which raids were being planned. It was as if he'd hacked the entire law enforcement system using nothing but cash and fear. Every mobster in New York lived in terror of the government's next move. Except Casso. He knew it before it happened. But he didn't just buy information. He bought death. The Mafia cops, as they'd later be called, became his most lethal weapon. When he wanted someone dead, he didn't send soldiers or hitmen. He sent badges. Ippolito and Caracappa would track targets using police databases, pull them over under the guise of a traffic stop, and execute them. No witnesses. No investigation. No suspects. Every time they killed for him, the system itself protected them. The first time Casso tested them, it was with a small job, a gambler who owed the family money and had started talking too much. Within days, the man was found shot to death in his car. The cops who responded to the scene had no idea they were staring at the work of their own. When Casso got word, he smiled faintly and said, "They work faster than my guys." From then on, he used them like clockwork. Names went in, bodies came out. Sometimes, he'd meet them personally in safe houses, slipping envelopes thick with cash across the table. Other times, he'd relay orders through intermediaries, never using names. He trusted their silence, but he never trusted their loyalty. Loyalty, he knew, was just another word for leverage, and leverage was always paid for in advance. Over time, the arrangement became an empire of its own. Ippolito and Caracappa weren't just feeding him information, they were cleaning up his messes. When one of his drug suppliers was arrested, the detectives sabotaged the case by stealing evidence from the precinct. When a Lucchese associate was suspected of cooperating, they pulled his file, found his location, and handed it over. The man was dead within 24 hours. It was efficiency Casso could never have imagined before. But what made the partnership truly dangerous was how invisible it was. The FBI couldn't comprehend it. They suspected leaks, but didn't know from where. Wiretaps failed, surveillance collapsed, informants vanished. It was as if Casso could read their minds. Agents began whispering among themselves that there must be someone high up feeding him information. They were right, but no one could prove it. Inside the underworld, Casso's reputation reached godlike status. He seemed untouchable, omniscient. He knew who was talking before the words even reached the wire. He knew which crews were being watched and which cops could be bought. The other family started calling him the man who knew everything. It wasn't just power anymore. It was myth. Still, even myths bleed. The Mafia cops weren't perfect, and greed has its own kind of gravity. The more money Casso paid them, the more they wanted. At first, it was a few thousand per job, then 10, then 20. Soon, the detectives were demanding bonuses for risk. Casso didn't like it. He didn't like being dependent on anyone, especially cops. He started spacing out their assignments, testing their loyalty with smaller requests. When they hesitated, he made a note of it. The partnership's most infamous job came in 1990, when Casso ordered the killing of Edward Lino, a Gambino captain he believed had been part of a failed plot to kill him. Ippolito and Caracappa executed the hit perfectly, pulling Lino over on a deserted Brooklyn street, shooting him in the head, and driving away. To the public, it was another mob hit. To the NYPD, it was a mystery. To Casso, it was confirmation. His reach extended even into the badge. After that, he began using them as his personal insurance policy. Whenever he felt threatened, they tightened the circle around him, intercepting reports, warning him of raids, even helping him move between safe houses. It was the perfect illusion of control. But control built on corruption is a sandcastle at high tide. The first cracks appeared when one of Casso's closest lieutenants, Alphonse Darko, began to suspect something was wrong. He couldn't understand how the boss always seemed one step ahead of law enforcement. The paranoia spread, and soon the whispers reached the wrong ears. Men began talking about the cops who kill, and the myth became too large to contain. The FBI was listening too. They started connecting dots, unsolved murders, missing evidence, suspicious patterns. Still, no one dared to believe that two decorated detectives were moonlighting as Mafia assassins. It was too insane to be true. But in Casso's world, insanity was just another word for strategy. Meanwhile, the detectives' involvement was deepening. They were killing not just for money, but for loyalty to Casso himself. In some twisted way, they admired him. He represented the kind of power they'd never achieve through the badge alone. The power to decide who lived and who died without consequence. But admiration in that world always turns to fear. They began to realize that Casso was more dangerous than any criminal they'd ever known, and one day, the bullets might come for them too. Casso, for his part, began to grow reckless. He bragged about his control over the cops, even in private conversations. He saw it as proof of his superiority, not just over other mobsters, but over the system itself. "I own the law," he said once, laughing over a glass of whiskey. What's left to fear? But arrogance always writes its own downfall. The FBI intensified its surveillance, and the walls began closing in. When Casso went on the run in 1991, his safety net of cops and connections started to unravel. The Mafia cops couldn't protect him forever. The FBI was closing in on them too, though they didn't know it yet. During his time as a fugitive, Casso still relied on the detectives, using them to keep track of his enemies and the law's movements. But the chaos of life on the run eroded the structure he'd built. Payments became inconsistent, messages delayed. Paranoia returned with a vengeance. He began to suspect that even the cops might turn on him for the right price. When the FBI finally caught him in 1993, Casso's greatest weapon became his greatest liability. In custody, desperate to save himself, he started talking. He told the government everything. The murders, the deals, the bribes, and the two detectives who had served him faithfully for years. At first, no one believed him. The idea was too outrageous. But then the evidence started matching his words. Records, bank statements, patterns, all pointing toward Ippolito and Caracappa. For the first time, the truth about Casso's empire was laid bare. He hadn't just infiltrated the NYPD, he corrupted its very core. The Mafia cops were real, and their crimes were worse than anyone imagined. Dozens of murders, thousands of secrets, and a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. Years later, when the detectives were finally convicted, their story would shock the nation. But for Casso, it was old news. He'd already destroyed everything worth keeping. The empire built on silence was gone. The men he trusted most were in prison, and the law he thought he owned now owned him. In the end, the partnership that had made him untouchable was what damned him. He had turned lawmen into killers, the protectors into predators, and in doing so, he'd proven something dark and undeniable. That corruption doesn't start with greed. It starts with fear. He once said, "Everyone's got a price. You just have to find what they're afraid of losing." He'd found theirs, and eventually, someone found his. In the flickering fluorescent light of his prison cell, Anthony Casso would replay those years like a film stuck on loop. The parked car, the handshake that wasn't a handshake, the first envelope of cash. He'd built an empire on secrets, and in the end, those secrets were all that survived him. The cops he bought had become his mirrors, men sworn to protect, twisted into reflections of the monster they served. They were proof that in a city like New York, good and evil didn't live on opposite sides of the badge. They shared the same silence, the same greed, the same fear of losing control. And as he sat alone, staring at the cracked wall of his cell, Casso couldn't help but smile at the irony. He'd owned the law, but the law had never been his to own. It had only been renting itself out, waiting for the day it would collect the debt. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Somewhere far away, a door slammed shut. The silence that followed was familiar, the same silence that had followed every deal, every killing, every betrayal. It was the sound of power dying, one echo at a time. And in that silence, Anthony Gaspipe Casso finally understood what it meant to have cops on the payroll. It wasn't control. It was prophecy. Because the moment you buy the law, you sign your own sentence. And when the law finally comes to collect, there's no envelope big enough to save you. Chapter 10. The Empire Unravels. It didn't happen in one night. Empires never collapse that quickly. They die in whispers, in quiet betrayals, in rooms where the air feels too heavy to breathe. Anthony Gaspipe Casso had built his kingdom from blood and silence. But now that silence was turning against him, what had once protected him was now suffocating him. In the early 1990s, the Lucchese family, the machine he had ruled through fear, was starting to crack, and every piece that fell carried a story soaked in betrayal. He could feel it before he could prove it. The streets were changing. The conversations felt shorter, colder. Old faces disappeared from familiar places. Men who once looked him in the eye now stared at the ground. It wasn't respect anymore. It was distance. Fear had done its job too well. The more people feared him, the less they trusted him. And without trust, even the strongest family becomes nothing more than a collection of ghosts. The FBI was circling closer than ever. New laws, new tactics, and a new kind of mobster were reshaping the game. The RICO Act had turned every conversation into potential evidence, every handshake into a liability. One informant could destroy an entire family, and by 1991, the Bureau had dozens of them. Men who had sworn oaths of silence were now reciting details in courtroom whispers, trading decades of loyalty for shorter sentences. Casso had always said no one could touch him, that his reach extended everywhere. But now, even he couldn't stop what was coming. It began with small losses, raids on gambling parlors, quiet arrests of soldiers, the disappearance of cash flows that once seemed endless. Then came the big one. Vic Amuso, his boss, his partner, his reflection in violence, was caught in Pennsylvania after more than a year on the run. Casso received the call late at night. The moment he hung up, he sat alone in silence, not out of shock, but calculation. For years, he and Amuso had run the family as two halves of the same monster, Amuso's rage and Casso's precision. But now, with Amuso behind bars, there was only one half left. For a moment, Casso believed this was freedom. He had always operated best in shadows, without a leash. Now he could rule without interference. But freedom in his world was just another word for exposure. The FBI had what they wanted, a living, breathing leader to chase. And Casso had just painted a target on his own back. The first to fall was trust. When Alphonse Darko, a respected Lucchese capo, realized that Casso's paranoia was spiraling into madness, he did the unthinkable. He flipped. For decades, Darko had been one of the family's most loyal men, a quiet, efficient figure who had survived through discipline. But when he learned that Casso was plotting his death, something inside him broke. He didn't want to die for a man who killed on impulse. So he walked into an FBI office and told them everything. The news hit Casso like a knife in the ribs. Darko knew too much. He knew names, routes, stash houses, secrets that could collapse everything. Casso's reaction wasn't fear, it was fury. He wanted Darko dead immediately, even though he was already under federal protection. He paced the floor of his safe house that night, muttering to himself, promising retribution. But for the first time, his words fell hollow. He couldn't reach everyone anymore. The walls were closing in faster than he could rebuild them. His world had always been built on information, on knowing before others did. But now, the flow was drying up. His sources inside law enforcement were disappearing. The Mafia cops, his secret advantage, had gone quiet, knowing the heat was too close. He was flying blind, and for a man like Casso, that was worse than death. The family began splintering. Men took sides, some loyal to Amuso, others to Casso. The rest just vanished, disappearing into safe houses or fleeing the state. Money stopped flowing. Crews stopped reporting. What had once been an empire of obedience was now a scattered army of survivors. Casso blamed everyone. He called them cowards, traitors, rats. But deep down, he knew the truth. Fear had kept them loyal only as long as it was profitable. Now that it wasn't, they were saving themselves. The FBI, meanwhile, was methodical. They weren't chasing him blindly. They were dismantling him piece by piece. Every informant they flipped led them closer. Every arrest brought new evidence. Casso's name appeared in more and more files, connected to dozens of murders, extortions, bribes. Agents spoke his name with a mixture of dread and fascination. They called him the Ghost of Brooklyn because he always seemed to disappear before they arrived. But even ghosts can't hide forever. Inside the family, the paranoia turned cannibalistic. Casso started ordering hits on his own men, convinced that everyone was betraying him. Soldiers disappeared for saying the wrong thing, for hesitating before answering, for looking away too quickly. One man, a driver who'd been with him for years, was found shot in the head after Casso decided his silence felt off. It didn't matter whether the suspicion was true. What mattered was eliminating the thought of betrayal before it took shape. Each killing made him feel momentarily safer, but also pushed the survivors further away. Soon, there were barely any soldiers left he could trust. He had money, guns, houses, and fear, but no people. a king without subjects, sitting on a throne of ashes. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same bed twice. He had safe houses scattered across New York and New Jersey, basements, apartments, garages. He used coded messages, payphones, burner cars. He wore disguises, changed his routine, even altered his hair. But no disguise could cover the paranoia, eating him alive. Every noise became a threat, every passing car a warning. There were moments when the loneliness cut through even his pride. Late at night, sitting alone with a drink, he'd think about the old days, the crowded clubs, the laughter of men who are now dead, the smell of cigar smoke and expensive suits. Those memories were gone, replaced by static. The mafia he'd known didn't exist anymore. The families were crumbling under indictments, betrayals, and fear. The code of silence, the very thing that had built his world, had turned into a myth. One night, he stared out a window overlooking the Hudson River, watching the lights flicker across the water. The city looked peaceful from a distance, but he knew better. Beneath the surface, everything was rotting, just like him. He whispered something to himself, almost a confession. We built something we couldn't control. Then, as if to prove his own words, the next morning he received a call from one of his few remaining loyalists. The FBI had raided another property. His accounts were frozen. His men were being questioned. The empire wasn't just crumbling, it was vanishing. The final betrayal came from within. One of his trusted lieutenants, worn down by fear and pressure, was caught in an unrelated bust. The feds offered him a deal, and he took it. He gave them everything: Casso's safe houses, routines, even the network of corrupt cops that had once shielded him. Within weeks, the walls were gone. The FBI knew where to look. The end was inevitable. On a gray morning in January 1993, Casso woke up in a small house in Mount Olive, New Jersey. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened a newspaper. The headline was about another mob arrest, someone from the Gambinos. Maybe, he didn't remember. For a brief second, he almost felt calm. Then he heard the sound of tires on gravel outside. He looked out the window and saw black cars. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring, as the FBI surrounded the house. When they broke down the door, he didn't reach for his gun. He didn't shout. He didn't resist. He raised his hands and said, almost casually, "You finally found me." It wasn't fear. It was fatigue. Years of running, killing, hiding, it had all led here. The end wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like the life he'd once worshipped. In custody, the facade of invincibility began to fade. The FBI had him cornered, but they weren't sure what to do with him. They knew he was dangerous, but they also knew he knew everything. For weeks, he barely spoke. Then, one day he started talking. And once he started, he didn't stop. He told them about the murders, the money, the corruption. He told them about the mafia cops, about the envelopes of cash, the secret meetings, the hits carried out under police badges. The agents who listened couldn't believe what they were hearing. He was confessing to things they hadn't even suspected yet. It wasn't guilt driving him, it was pride. He wanted them to know how brilliant he'd been, how close he'd come to perfection. But cooperation with Casso was like dancing on a knife's edge. He'd give information, then threaten the people he was exposing. He'd name names, then contradict himself. He wanted protection, but he also wanted control. It was the same game he'd always played, except now the audience wore suits and badges instead of leather jackets. His testimony brought down men across the city. Detectives, mobsters, union bosses, all fell under the weight of his words. But the government soon realized something dangerous. Casso didn't want redemption. He wanted revenge. When he started lying, exaggerating, and even plotting against witnesses from inside custody, the FBI pulled the plug. They dropped him as a cooperator, the first time in history they had ever done so. When they told him, he just smiled. "You can't drop me," he said. "You still need me." But they didn't. They had everything they needed: the confessions, the witnesses, the evidence. He'd built his own cell with his own mouth. The empire he'd created was gone. The men he'd ruled were either dead or imprisoned. The Lucchese family that had once feared his name was now a relic of history, a cautionary tale whispered in courtrooms and documentaries. The FBI called his downfall the death of the old Mafia. In his cell, Casso refused to admit defeat. He still carried himself like a boss, barking orders at guards, demanding respect. But in the quiet hours, when no one was watching, he would sit alone and stare at the wall, lost in thought. The silence he'd once weaponized was now his only companion. It wasn't the comfortable stillness of control anymore. It was emptiness, the kind that swallows everything. He had outlived the family, outlived the code, outlived the myth. The empire had unraveled completely, leaving behind nothing but ashes and ghosts. He had wanted to rule forever, but forever had turned out to be smaller than he imagined. A gray room, a metal bed, and the echo of his own breathing. The last time an FBI agent saw him, years later, they said he was sitting in that same position, staring at the floor. When they asked what he was thinking about, he answered without looking up. "Nothing," he said. "It's all gone." He was right. The empire was gone. The streets that once bowed to him had moved on. The silence that had once defined his power was now the sound of his oblivion. And somewhere deep in the city he once ruled, the wind moved through empty alleys, carrying with it the faintest whisper of a name that once made New York tremble, Gaspipe. A name that had built an empire from fear and lost it to the same thing. Chapter 11. The Fugitive Years. When Anthony Gaspipe Casso went on the run in 1991, the streets of New York changed their rhythm. It was like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next explosion, the next disappearance, the next rumor that would slither from one dark corner to another. For nearly 2 years, he moved like a phantom through the cracks of the American underworld, alive but untouchable, hunted but unbroken. The FBI called him a fugitive. The Mafia whispered that he was a ghost. But for Casso, it wasn't escape. It was survival. The last desperate act of a man who had built his empire out of silence and was now being swallowed by it. The decision to vanish wasn't made in panic. Casso never panicked. He saw it coming long before the agents started closing in. The indictments were piling up, the whispers in the street were getting louder, and the family he had ruled with terror was eating itself alive. He knew it was only a matter of time before one of his own turned on him. So one night, as the city slept, he disappeared. No grand goodbye, no word to his wife or children, just gone. The first safe house was in Brooklyn, a small apartment above an auto body shop that smelled of gasoline and metal dust. It was owned by an old associate who owed him favors from decades back. Casso spent the first few weeks there in silence, barely sleeping, smoking in the dark while the radio murmured old news. He listened to every word, every name mentioned, looking for signs. Who had flipped, who was missing, who was next. Every headline felt personal. Every arrest another ghost tugging at his sleeve. He didn't move around much at first. The fewer faces he saw, the safer he felt. The Lucchese family was splitting apart between those loyal to Vicamuso, who was already behind bars, and those still loyal to Casso, who was now the most wanted man in New York. The streets were filled with paranoia. No one knew who was giving orders anymore. Some said Casso was hiding in Staten Island. Others claimed he had fled to Florida or Europe. The truth was far less glamorous. He was sitting in a dusty apartment, eating out of paper containers, and listening to the sound of his own heartbeat echo through the walls. He still had money, of course, millions stashed away in secret accounts, hidden in warehouses and basements across the city. But money couldn't buy trust, and trust had been extinct for years. He used couriers to move cash and messages, changing them often so no one could learn too much. He spoke to no one directly except 2 men, one for business, one for logistics. Neither knew where he slept. Both knew they would die if they betrayed him. The nights were the hardest. The silence that had once made him powerful now pressed against him like a weight. Every creak in the floorboards, every engine idling outside made his heart quicken. He had always believed he understood fear better than anyone else, but living inside it was different. Fear, he learned, was patient. It didn't come crashing in with gunfire. It leaked in slowly, filling every empty space until there was nowhere left to hide. After a few months, he left Brooklyn. Too many faces were starting to recognize him. Too many whispers following him down the block. He moved to New Jersey, renting a house under a fake name through a contact who didn't ask questions. From the outside, it was an ordinary life. The neighbors thought he was a quiet, middle-aged businessman with bad posture and no family. He drove a modest car, took out the trash, nodded politely to the mailman. But inside the house, every window was covered, every door bolted, every step calculated. He kept a small arsenal, handguns, a shotgun, extra ammunition, always within reach. He rotated the hiding spots weekly, a habit born from paranoia. Sometimes he would sit up all night, gun in hand, watching the glow of streetlights fade with dawn. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, he had been the one people feared. Now, he was the one waiting for a knock that could end everything. And yet, in a twisted way, he enjoyed it. The constant movement, the deception, the chase, it reminded him of the old days before he became a boss, when he was just another street soldier, surviving by instinct and violence. It was almost comforting. Almost. His wife, Lillian, didn't hear from him for months. The FBI had placed her under surveillance, hoping she'd lead them to him. She never did. Whatever else Anthony Casso was, he loved his family in his own fractured way, and he wouldn't risk dragging them down with him. He communicated once through a coded message sent through an old friend, a phrase from a song they both knew. It was enough to let her know he was alive. Nothing more. By the middle of 1992, the walls were closing in. The FBI had turned half of the Lucchese hierarchy. Names like Alphonse Darko and Peter Fat Pete Kyoto were now federal witnesses, giving up secrets faster than the Bureau could write them down. Each testimony brought them closer to Casso. His name was on every chart, every timeline, every indictment. Agents worked day and night tracking old associates, wiretapping relatives, raiding stash houses. They called it Operation Lucchese, but among themselves, they had a different name for it: the ghost hunt. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Casso's empire had rotted from within. The Mafia cops who had once protected him were now liabilities, their names whispered in FBI offices with a mix of disbelief and disgust. Even Casso's own soldiers were defecting one by one. The code of silence had finally shattered, and its echoes were being recorded in interrogation rooms across the city. But Casso wasn't easy prey. He had built his life on reading people, and he could smell betrayal before it happened. Whenever the FBI got close to one of his safe houses, he vanished. There were stories, half rumor, half truth, of agents missing him by hours, sometimes minutes. Once, they raided a house in Queens and found the stove still warm, a half-smoked cigarette on the table. It was as if he'd dissolved into the air. He traveled lightly. Cash, IDs, a change of clothes, a gun. He avoided phones, banks, and anything that left a trail. When he needed information, he paid for it in person. When he needed to move, he did it at night. Every step was deliberate, every breath planned. It was survival distilled to science. But even science has limits. As the months dragged on, isolation began to sink its claws into him. He started talking to himself, rehearsing conversations that would never happen. He'd imagine walking into the Lucchese headquarters again, sitting at the table, staring down the men who betrayed him. In those fantasies, he was still the boss, still in control. Then the sound of a passing siren would pull him back to reality. A small, rented room. A man alone with ghosts. By late 1992, the strain was visible. His health was failing. The stress, the poor diet, the constant fear, it was catching up. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The walls seemed to close in, the air too thin. He'd grip the gun beside his bed until the panic subsided. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd rebuild once the heat died down. But deep down, he knew it was over. The family, the business, the code, it had all dissolved while he was hiding in the dark. His capture came not through betrayal, but inevitability. The FBI had been watching his movements, tracking the network of safe houses he'd been using. One of his couriers slipped up, leading them to a rented home in Mount Olive, New Jersey. It was early morning, cold and quiet, when the agents surrounded the house. They didn't know what to expect. Casso was infamous for violence, and they were ready for a firefight. But when they broke through the door, he was sitting calmly at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. He looked up at them, almost amused, and said, "You're late." The agents froze for a second, unsure if it was a trick. Then they cuffed him, reading his rights as he smirked. There was no fight, no chase, no dramatic ending. The most feared man in New York went down without a sound. In the car, on the way to the FBI headquarters, one agent asked him why he didn't run. Casso just looked out the window and said, "Where was I going to go?" It wasn't defeat. It was realism. He had spent his life running, from rivals, from lawmen, from himself. There was nowhere left to hide. The arrest made headlines across the country. Gaspipe Casso caught. The newspapers screamed. Reporters camped outside FBI buildings. Mob historians dusted off old files, and former associates pretended not to know him. Inside the bureau, there was relief mixed with disbelief. They had caught the man who had outsmarted them for years. But they knew it wasn't over. Men like Casso didn't stop talking once the handcuffs went on. In interrogation, he was calm, almost conversational. He refused to show fear, even when they laid out the evidence. When an agent asked him how many murders he'd ordered, he shrugged. "More than you can count," he said. "Less than I could have." The room went silent. That was his way of saying he didn't regret any of it. But beneath the bravado, something had cracked. The fugitive years had stripped him down to his core. There were no soldiers left to protect him, no family to hide behind, no city that still belonged to him. The silence he'd always controlled had turned into isolation. And isolation, for a man like him, was worse than death. Still, even in captivity, he clung to a sense of power. He offered to cooperate with the government, to tell them everything about the Mafia, the cops, the murders. He wanted to be the center of the storm again. And for a brief time, he was. The FBI listened, hungry for details. He gave them names, dates, and secrets that reshaped the history of organized crime. But just like before, he overplayed his hand. He manipulated, lied, and threatened from inside prison walls, until even the government grew tired of him. By the time they realized he was unmanageable, it didn't matter. He had given them enough to destroy what was left of the old world. The Lucchese family, the commission, the Mafia cops, it all came tumbling down because one man couldn't stop talking. In the quiet that followed, Casso sat alone in his cell, the same way he had sat in his safe houses. The difference was that now, there was nowhere left to run. The walls were thicker, the silence permanent. The city that had once trembled at his name went back to its rhythm. Cars honked, people hurried, buildings rose. Life went on without him. And yet, somewhere in the shadows of Brooklyn, an old bar might still keep his story alive. A whisper over whiskey, a name spoken too softly to be sure. Gaspipe, the ghost who ruled New York, then disappeared into it. The fugitive years had taught him one final truth. Power isn't lost in one blow. It decays, piece by piece, until all that's left is a man staring at the walls he built, realizing too late that they were always his cage. Chapter 12. The Turncoat. The day Anthony Gaspipe Casso decided to talk, the walls of every mob family in New York trembled. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not for him. Not for the man who had built his entire reputation on fear, loyalty, and silence. He had mocked rats his whole life, buried them alive, put canaries in their mouths to mock their betrayal. And now, here he was, sitting in a federal holding cell, contemplating the unthinkable. The man who had once made the city shake was about to switch sides. It started quietly, as most dangerous things do. The FBI had him cornered, facing nearly 70 counts of murder, racketeering, conspiracy, and more. Life in prison was guaranteed, but Casso wasn't the kind of man who accepted guarantees. He'd been built on survival, and survival meant doing whatever it took to stay alive. When the agents offered him a deal, to talk, to trade his secrets for safety, he didn't answer right away. He just stared at them for a long time, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he said the words no one thought he'd ever say. "Let's talk." When word reached the underworld, disbelief rippled through it like a bomb blast. Gaspipe Casso, the same man who had personally ordered the deaths of anyone suspected of cooperating, was now doing exactly that. The hypocrisy didn't bother him. In his mind, this wasn't betrayal. It was strategy. He wasn't turning because he feared prison. He was turning because he wanted control. Even inside a cell, he refused to be powerless. If he couldn't rule the streets, he would rule the courtroom. His first meetings with federal agents were unlike anything they had ever experienced. Most mobsters came in broken, contrite, willing to trade information out of desperation. Casso was different. He treated the sessions like business meetings. He didn't beg, he negotiated. He'd sit with his hands folded neatly, his tone calm, his memory sharp. "You want information?" He'd say. "Fine, but it's going to cost you." And he delivered. The things he revealed were unlike anything the FBI had heard before. He named corrupt cops, federal leaks, hidden money pipelines, and unsolved murders. He confirmed long-standing suspicions about the Mafia's infiltration of unions, construction, and government contracts. But the bombshell came when he talked about his secret alliance with two NYPD detectives, Louis Eppolito and Stephen Caracappa, the so-called Mafia cops. At first, the agents didn't believe him. The idea that two decorated New York detectives had moonlighted as killers for the mob was too outrageous to be real. But Casso's details were too precise to ignore. He named victims, described the murders, even gave dates. He told them how he'd paid the cops thousands to tip him off about investigations and to execute hits. "They were better than my own guys," he said. "They had badges. They could go anywhere, do anything, and no one asked questions." The agents cross-checked his claims, and to their astonishment, everything matched. Case files, witness statements, old reports, it all lined up. For the FBI, it was a revelation. For the NYPD, it was a nightmare. Casso's testimony was a gold mine, but it came with a price. He wanted protection, money, and special treatment. He demanded better food, more privacy, and contact with his family. He even insisted on choosing where he'd be held. "I'm not like the others," he said once. "You treat me right, and I'll give you everything." And for a while they did. He was moved to a secure location, given privileges no other informant had. He began to talk endlessly, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. His memory was eerie. He recited names, addresses, meeting spots, crimes committed decades earlier. The agents filled notebook after notebook. He spoke about the commission, the inner workings of every family, the secret killings that never made headlines. But what fascinated them most was how he spoke about himself. There was no remorse, no hesitation. He described murders like a man reading from a ledger. When asked how many people he had personally killed, he leaned back and said, "Maybe 40, give or take. But who's counting?" Behind the calm tone was a man who had spent his entire life mastering control. Cooperation wasn't surrender. It was his new weapon. Inside the system, he could manipulate from within, playing one agency against another. He gave just enough to keep himself valuable, but never enough to be replaced. The FBI knew it, but they needed him too badly to stop. Still, cracks began to show. Casso's personality was volcanic. When something didn't go his way, the calm mask shattered. He screamed at agents, threatened prosecutors, accused other informants of stealing his spotlight. "I built this case," he once shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Without me, you got nothing." The truth was, he wasn't wrong. His testimony had exposed one of the biggest scandals in NYPD history and given prosecutors leverage against multiple mob families. But he was becoming impossible to manage. He'd make deals with one investigator and break them with another. He bragged to guards that he was running the government from his cell. One day he'd offer new information. The next, he'd deny ever saying it. He began contacting other inmates, threatening witnesses through coded messages. For the agents, It was a nightmare. They realized Casso wasn't cooperating because he wanted redemption. He was cooperating because it gave him power. And power, for him, was oxygen. Take it away, and he'd suffocate. The turning point came when prosecutors discovered he had been secretly trying to bribe other prisoners to attack witnesses who testified against him. It was the final straw. After months of internal debate, the government made a decision unprecedented in federal history. They dropped him. Anthony Gaspipe Casso was officially removed as a government witness. The man who had once been their greatest asset had become their greatest liability. When they told him, he laughed. "You can't drop me," he said. "You'll come back. You'll need me again." But they didn't. For once, the silence didn't serve him. His usefulness was over. They transferred him back into the general prison population. No more privileges, no more private cells, no more special treatment. He was just another inmate now, another name on a roster. To most men, that would have been defeat. To Casso, it was insult. He raged for days, screaming at guards, throwing his food, demanding meetings with prosecutors who refused to see him. His world, the one he had controlled through fear, through silence, through manipulation, was gone. From then on, he spoke less. The words that had once made him powerful now meant nothing. Inmates avoided him. Some respected him, others feared him, but no one trusted him. Even in prison, his reputation for violence lingered. He was kept in isolation most of the time, for his safety and everyone else's. The FBI's notes from that era describe him as volatile, narcissistic, unpredictable. But one phrase stood out: a man incapable of silence. That was the irony of his life. The silence that had built his empire was now the one thing he couldn't bear. Alone in his cell, he'd pace for hours, muttering to himself, replaying the past like a film. The faces of the men he'd killed, the friends he'd betrayed, the family he'd lost, they all blurred together until the line between memory and madness disappeared. But there was one thing that never left him: pride. Even at his lowest, he refused to see himself as weak. When journalists wrote about his cooperation, calling him a rat, he responded through a lawyer's letter: "I did what I had to do." That's not being a rat. That's being smart. To him, morality was a luxury for people who didn't have power, and power was all he had ever known. Still, every empire ends the same way, not with an explosion, but with decay. The legend of Gaspipe Casso faded. The streets that once belonged to him were now ruled by others who didn't even remember his name. The Mafia he had helped destroy was now a shadow of itself. The cops he had corrupted were in prison. The family he had ruled with an iron fist was broken. And Casso himself, once feared by thousands, was now just another old man locked behind steel doors. In the end, his cooperation achieved something no law enforcement agency could have done alone. It killed the myth of the untouchable gangster. He had been both the executioner and the witness, the criminal and the informant, the king and the fool. He had become the embodiment of what the Mafia had turned into, an empire that ate itself alive. Years later, one of the agents who had interviewed him described him perfectly. Casso was the kind of man who'd burn the world down just to warm his hands. And maybe that's what he'd done. He burned everything: the families, the code, his reputation, until all that was left was ash. But in his own mind, he never lost. He had always believed that as long as someone was talking about him, he was still winning. And they were. Even now, decades later, his name still lingered in the halls of organized crime history, a ghost of fear, arrogance, and betrayal. The man who turned the word rat into a weapon, and then became one himself. Anthony Gaspipe Casso had built his world on silence and fear. But when the silence broke and the fear turned inward, all he could do was talk. And in the end, his words destroyed everything he ever built, including himself. Because the truth was simple, brutal, and final. In the underworld, silence was sacred until the day it became too heavy to carry. Chapter 13: Life Behind Bars. When the steel door slammed shut behind Anthony Gaspipe Casso, It wasn't just a sound. It was the closing of an entire era. The clang echoed through the corridors of the federal prison like a verdict that didn't need words. For the first time in his life, Casso wasn't the one giving orders. He wasn't the man in control, the name that made men tremble. Inside these walls, he was just another inmate, a number in the system. But Gaspipe was never going to accept that quietly. He had ruled with fear for decades. He wasn't about to start obeying it now. He arrived at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York wearing the same calm expression that had terrified killers and charmed politicians. To the guards, he was another aging gangster. To the inmates, he was a legend. They whispered his name like a ghost story. Gaspipe, the man who killed without blinking, the one who owned cops, judges, and fear itself. Some looked at him with awe. Others kept their distance. They'd all heard the rumors. If he could make cops disappear, what chance did a prisoner have? But Casso didn't want friends. He didn't need respect from convicts. He had one goal now: survival on his own terms. The federal government had stripped him of power, of money, of influence, but he still had the one thing they couldn't take: the ability to make people uneasy just by being in the room. He used it like armor. He spoke softly, moved slowly, and never broke eye contact. Every glance felt like a threat. At first, he tried to play the system. He believed, or at least convinced himself, that he could manipulate prison life the same way he manipulated the streets. He bribed guards for extra food, paid inmates for favors, and treated every conversation like a transaction. Even behind bars, he found ways to live better than most. Small luxuries hidden in plain sight. Cigarettes, extra portions, new shoes, magazines. But power in prison is fragile. It doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from alliances, and alliances require trust. Trust for Casso was extinct. The Bureau of Prisons placed him under heavy restrictions. He was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too connected. He was isolated from other high-profile mobsters to prevent information leaks. No contact with the outside world except through approved channels. No unmonitored visits. No second chances. The man who once commanded hundreds of killers now spent 23 hours a day in a concrete box, his world reduced to the sound of his own breathing and the hum of fluorescent lights. He tried to write letters, long, rambling notes to his wife, his children, sometimes even to reporters. They were full of contradictions. In one line, he'd talk about missing his family. In the next, he'd justify every murder he'd ever ordered. He wrote like a man trying to convince himself he was still human. But between the lines, something darker always showed, a bitterness that grew sharper every year. He blamed everyone for his downfall. The FBI, the Mafia, his friends, even Amuso, the man who'd once been like a brother to him. They all turned, he wrote once. I stayed who I was. They couldn't handle that. Prison has a way of stripping away illusions, but Casso clung to his. He still saw himself as the boss, still gave orders to no one in particular, still expected the world to bend around him. In the early years, he sent messages out through visitors and lawyers, small directives meant to influence what remained of his empire. But as time passed, those channels dried up. The Lucchese family had moved on. The new generation of gangsters didn't care about Gaspipe's legacy. To them, he was a relic, a cautionary tale about power gone wrong. The realization hit him slowly, like rust spreading across steel. He was no longer feared. The new mob didn't whisper his name with reverence anymore. They barely whispered at all. The empire he'd built through blood had been absorbed into history. All the power, all the killings, all the rules gone. The only thing left was the echo of who he'd been. Inside, time changed meaning. Days blurred into each other. He kept track of them by the meals, by the sound of guards' footsteps, by the light that shifted through the tiny window high on his wall. He began to age fast. The stress, the anger, the isolation, it ate away at him. His health declined, but he refused to show weakness. Even when his back hurt, even when he coughed up blood, he hid it. Pride was all he had left. There were moments when the mask cracked. At night, when the noise of the prison faded, He would sit on his bunk and stare at the concrete, lost in memory. Sometimes he'd mutter to himself, rehearsing conversations with ghosts. Other times, he'd smile faintly, remembering something no one else knew. To an observer, it might have looked like madness. But for Casso, it was control, the last kind he could still exercise. He was moved several times over the years, from one facility to another, sometimes for security reasons, sometimes because the Bureau had grown tired of his constant complaints. He argued with guards, filed grievances, demanded better treatment. He claimed he was being poisoned, that guards were plotting against him, that inmates were out to kill him. Maybe some of it was true. Maybe paranoia had finally eaten him whole. The truth was, prison hadn't broken him. It had amplified what was already there. The same paranoia, the same ruthlessness, the same hunger for power. It just no longer had anywhere to go. He became known among staff as manipulative and dangerous. He'd smile one minute and threaten the next. He'd offer information to one officer and curse another. He played games because games were all he had left. Every now and then, he'd receive a newspaper and read about the old days, the arrests, the new trials, the slow extinction of the world he'd ruled. John Gotti was dead. Amuso was still alive, serving his life sentence. The Mafia was fading into something smaller, something unrecognizable. He would stare at the headlines for hours, his fingers tracing the names of men who were once untouchable. Then he'd tear the pages into tiny pieces and flush them away. In one rare interview years later, a former prison guard described Casso as a man who still thought he was outside. Even in chains, he carried himself with a posture of command. He didn't slouch, didn't shuffle like other inmates. He moved with purpose, even if there was nowhere to go. When guards escorted him through hallways, he walked in silence, head held high, eyes forward. It wasn't dignity, it was defiance. His isolation became permanent after a violent incident with another inmate. No one knew exactly what happened. Some said it was an argument over food. Others claimed the man had insulted him. Whatever the reason, the fight ended brutally. Casso was moved to solitary confinement indefinitely. The cell was smaller than a bathroom, the light never fully off. He lived like that for years, alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and the faint sound of air hissing through vents. As his health worsened, he began to lose track of time. The world outside had long stopped caring. He was an artifact now, a ghost trapped in the machine of the American justice system. His letters stopped coming. His family drifted away, tired of the chaos, the shame, the endless cycle of false promises. He had tried, once, to reconnect with his children, but his words always circled back to himself. Even love, for him, was just another negotiation. He spent his last years at a medical facility inside the federal system. The doctors noted his decline, heart problems, kidney failure, diabetes. The same man who had once orchestrated murder with precision was now kept alive by pills and machines. The guards still treated him cautiously, as if he might rise from the bed and order a hit. But the danger had long since drained from him. He was smaller now, frail, his voice thin and quiet. The eyes, though, remained sharp. Even dying, he didn't look away from anyone. Visitors were rare. Most of his old associates were dead, imprisoned, or too afraid to see him. The ones who did come found a man who refused to acknowledge his own end. "I ain't done yet," he'd say with a faint smirk. But even he knew it was a lie. Death, like betrayal, was inevitable, and both had been his companions for too long to fear. He spent his final months under heavy restrictions, his world reduced to medical charts and sterile walls. The staff called him Mr. Casso, never Gaspipe. It was as if the name itself had been retired. Sometimes he'd ask for the old newspapers again, just to see the world he'd left behind. Other times, he'd stare out the narrow window, whispering names under his breath. People he'd killed, people who'd betrayed him, people who were long gone. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was a roll call. There were no grand speeches at the end, no confessions, no apologies. He died in December of 2020, at 78 years old, from complications of COVID-19. The virus swept through the prison, indifferent to status or history. For a man who had escaped countless bullets, betrayals, and manhunts, it was a quiet, almost anticlimactic death. No blood, no revenge, no spectacle, just the steady slowing of breath, the fade of a legend. When the news broke, the headlines were brief. Anthony Gaspipe, Casso dead at 78. No outrage, no mourning. Just a line at the end of a long, violent story. The world moved on. But for those who remembered, there was a strange kind of silence, a space where fear used to live. In the end, prison had done what no rival, no FBI agent, no bullet could. It made him invisible. The same man who once held New York hostage with terror had become another forgotten inmate, his name reduced to a cautionary footnote in history. The silence he had once ruled through had swallowed him whole. Somewhere deep inside those walls, maybe in his final hours, he must have realized it, that the empire, the loyalty, the power, they were all illusions. That the silence he had worshipped wasn't control, it was loneliness. That the same walls he'd used to trap others had finally trapped him. And so, the story of Gaspipe Casso didn't end with a gunshot or a betrayal. It ended in stillness. A man alone in a cell, listening to the hum of a fluorescent light, waiting for a knock that would never come. Life behind bars didn't just punish him, it revealed him. The killer, the manipulator, the self-proclaimed king of fear, reduced to a man counting his own breaths, trapped inside the very silence he once commanded. Chapter 14. The Fall of the Mafia Cops. For years, the legend of the Mafia Cops lingered in the underworld like a rumor no one wanted to believe. Two decorated NYPD detectives, men sworn to uphold the law, had secretly worked for Anthony Gaspipe Casso, feeding him secrets, carrying out murders, and protecting him from the very system hunting him. It sounded too twisted, too cinematic to be real. But reality in Casso's world had always blurred the line between impossible and inevitable. Their fall would become one of the darkest chapters in New York's history, a tale of greed, betrayal, and the long shadow of the man who had created them. When Casso first told the FBI about Louis Ippolito and Stephen Caracappa during his cooperation phase, they didn't want to believe him. The Bureau had heard outlandish claims from informants before, lies dressed as leverage, but this one was different. Casso's details were surgical. He gave dates, addresses, crime scenes, even badge numbers. He described how Ippolito and Caracappa had pulled men off the street in broad daylight, how they provided him with federal intelligence reports, and how they'd murdered on command. The agents listening to him sat stunned, not because of the violence. Casso's confessions were full of that, but because of the betrayal. If he was telling the truth, it meant the rot wasn't just in the streets. It was in the badge itself. They filed his statements away at first, unsure what to make of them. But as years passed, pieces of evidence began to surface, quiet and haunting. Unsolved murders matched Casso's timeline. Corrupt records in NYPD databases lined up with his claims. It was like seeing the outline of a monster slowly emerge from the fog. The deeper investigators dug, the more the story took shape. And when it finally broke, it sent shockwaves through every corner of law enforcement. Ippolito had been the son of a mobster. His father, Ralph Ippolito, had ties to the Gambino family, but Louis had chosen a different path, or so it seemed. He'd joined the police force, earned commendations, and even wrote a book called Mafia Cop, ironically painting himself as a hero who resisted temptation. But behind the facade, temptation had long since won. Caracappa, his partner, was quieter, methodical, calculating, the kind of cop who understood the system so deeply he knew exactly how to twist it. Together, they formed a bond that blurred every moral line. They didn't just take bribes, they sold access to life and death. Casso was their best customer. Through them, he became untouchable. They warned him when surveillance was coming, told him which of his men were cooperating, even handed over confidential FBI files. It was like playing chess while your opponent secretly gave you his playbook. And when Casso needed someone eliminated, they did that too. They didn't kill for honor or for revenge. They killed for cash, for the cold transaction that reduced life to a line item. One of their most infamous murders was that of Eddie Lino, a Gambino captain suspected of being part of a plot against Casso. The hit was as chilling as it was efficient. The two detectives pulled Lino over on a quiet Brooklyn street, flashing their badges. He rolled down his window, thinking it was a routine stop. They shot him point-blank in the face, left his body slumped behind the wheel, and drove off without a trace. It was a perfect crime, because no one would suspect the police. For years, they got away with it. They lived like ordinary men, steady paychecks, families, neighbors who waved good morning. The city trusted them because they wore the uniform. They were the embodiment of a truth that Casso had known his whole life. Power means nothing if it's not invisible. But the truth has a way of rotting through even the strongest walls. After Casso's arrest and his explosive confessions, the case against them began to form slowly, like ice spreading across a pond. It took years of investigation, cross-referencing old murders, financial records, and testimony from other mobsters. By the early 2000s, prosecutors had enough to reopen the files. They started with the small details. Ippolito and Caracapa's bank accounts showed deposits that didn't match their salaries. Property records revealed luxury homes far beyond what detectives could afford. Witnesses began to come forward, men who had once been too afraid to talk. Each statement painted the same picture: two cops who had turned crime into business. When the indictments finally dropped in 2005, it was like a thunderclap. The charges read like something out of a nightmare: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, and 8 murders committed on behalf of the Lucchese family. New York had seen corruption before, but nothing like this. These weren't dirty cops. They were assassins with badges. The trial was a spectacle. Reporters packed the courtroom, hungry for every detail. Ippolito, gray-haired and heavier now, still carried himself with swagger, cracking jokes and flashing smiles. Caracappa was the opposite, stone-faced, detached, a man who had lived too long in the shadows to fear the light. The prosecution laid out their crimes piece by piece, using Casso's testimony as the backbone. They painted a picture of greed that spanned decades, of police who had become predators instead of protectors. Witnesses described the murders, the meetings, the envelopes of cash. Old detectives who had once worked alongside them testified, voices heavy with disbelief and shame. The evidence was undeniable. The jury didn't need long. Both men were found guilty on all major counts. The sentence: life in prison. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. There was no triumph in it, just exhaustion. Justice, in this case, felt like too little, too late. The damage had already been done. The trust had already been broken. The stain on the badge would never fully wash away. In prison, Ippolito and Caracappa lived out their final years as inmates, surrounded by the kind of men they had once arrested. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They tried to maintain dignity, claiming they had been framed, that the Mafia had lied to save itself. But the evidence spoke louder than their words. Even their fellow prisoners treated them with contempt. In the underworld, there's no respect for a man who betrays his own code, cop or criminal. Casso followed their downfall from afar. By the time they were convicted, he was already deep in his own sentence, aging, sick, and forgotten. But when he heard the news, he reportedly laughed. "I told them," he said to another inmate. "I told them years ago. Nobody wanted to listen." It was the only time in his life his lies had finally become truth. For Casso, their fall was vindication. The world had doubted him, dismissed his confessions as the ramblings of a desperate man, and now they were proven right. But vindication didn't bring him freedom. It didn't change the fact that he had created them, that he had corrupted them, that they were the reflection of everything he stood for. The Mafia cops were his legacy, and their destruction was his final act. The public's reaction was complicated. Some saw the case as proof that no one, Not even the police was above the law. Others saw it as confirmation that corruption was too deeply embedded to ever truly root out. The media called it a betrayal beyond comprehension. The NYPD launched internal reforms, new oversight committees, endless investigations into old cases. But trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild. It scars. In the years that followed, both men tried to appeal their convictions. Ippolito died in prison in 2019, still insisting on his innocence. Caracappa had died 2 years earlier, never admitting anything. Their families mourned them as victims of circumstance, but the streets remembered them as monsters with shields. For the FBI agents who had worked the case, the victory fell hollow. They had uncovered one of the most shocking scandals in law enforcement history, but the cost had been enormous. Dozens of murders, families destroyed, years of mistrust. The idea that sworn officers could have served as enforcers for a mob boss shattered something fundamental about the city. Even decades later, the mention of their names still sent chills through old detectives. And for the few who still spoke about Casso, the story always came back to the same point. The Mafia cops weren't just another crime. They were the embodiment of Casso's genius and his evil. He had understood people too well. He knew everyone had a price, even those who claimed to be incorruptible. He had proven that fear and greed could corrupt anything: justice, loyalty, even the badge. One agent who worked on the case said it best. Casso didn't just infect the underworld. He infected the city itself. By the time the Mafia cop story ended, Casso was already fading into history. The newspapers that once printed his name in bold letters now mention him only in passing. But their convictions kept his shadow alive. Every headline about Ippolito and Caracappa was, in some way, about him. Every time someone asked how it could have happened, his name was whispered underneath it all. Their fall completed the cycle he had set in motion decades earlier, the blending of law and crime until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. He had built an empire from corruption, and even after its collapse, its echoes reached into the heart of the system meant to destroy him. And maybe, in his twisted way, that was the victory he had always wanted. Not money, not power, but proof. Proof that his darkness had spread so deep it couldn't be contained. The Mafia cops died in prison, just like their master. But their story didn't die with them. It became legend, a reminder that the line between right and wrong is thinner than anyone wants to believe, and once it's crossed, there's no coming back. For Anthony Casso, it was poetic justice. He had corrupted the purest thing in the system and watched it collapse under the weight of its own sin. And when the world gasped in horror, he smiled from the shadows. Because in the end, that was what Gaspipe had always done best: turn belief into doubt, order into chaos, and loyalty into a weapon. The fall of the Mafia cops wasn't just the end of the scandal. It was the final echo of Casso's reign, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals aren't always in the streets. Sometimes they wear the badge, and when that happens, the world doesn't end in gunfire. It ends in silence, a silence that still hangs over New York like a ghost, whispering the names of the men who proved that even justice can be bought. Chapter 15. Legacy of Fear. Anthony, Gaspipe, Casso never wanted to be forgotten. Men like him don't dream of peace or redemption. They dream of immortality. Not the kind carved in marble or written in history books, but the kind that lingers in whispers, in dark bars, in the corners of stories told when the night feels too long and the streets too quiet. For decades, his name was a heartbeat beneath New York's concrete, a rhythm of fear and respect that pulsed through the veins of every man who thought he could control this city. But time erases everything, even fear, and yet, the shadow of Gaspipe still moves quietly across history, refusing to die. He had spent his life believing he could outthink everyone. The law, his rivals, even death. And in a way he had. He had lived longer than most of the men who had followed him, killed for him, or tried to destroy him. But survival doesn't mean victory. It just means you get to watch the ruins longer. And when he died in a hospital prison bed in December 2020, his body frail and unrecognizable, the world barely noticed. There were no headlines screaming his name, no camera crews outside the gates, no legacy parade of mourners. Just a line in the paper, cold and clinical, summarizing a lifetime of violence in a sentence. Anthony Gaspipe Casso, former Lucchese underboss, dead at 78. But legends don't need headlines. They need silence, the kind that fills the air after the story ends. And for those who still remembered him, that silence carried a weight. Because what he left behind wasn't just a trail of bodies or a fractured crime family. He left behind a question. How does a man like that come to exist? How does someone born in an ordinary Brooklyn home become a symbol of absolute fear? Casso's story had started with survival, and it ended with it. Every decision, every betrayal, every murder, it was all part of a twisted logic he called protection. Protect yourself. Protect your name. Protect what's yours. But in protecting himself, he had destroyed everything around him. The Lucchese family, once one of the most disciplined and powerful organizations in the American Mafia, was now a ghost of its former self. The old structure was gone. The soldiers were scattered. The code of silence that once defined them had been replaced by cooperation deals and court transcripts. Casso had helped dismantle the very thing he claimed to defend. In interviews after his death, former law enforcement officers described him as a paradox, a man who combined brilliance with brutality, discipline with madness. He was smart, one retired agent said. Too smart. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to be feared, even when there was no one left to fear him. That was the tragedy of Gaspipe Casso. Fear had made him powerful, but it had also made him alone. For years, younger mobsters used his name as a warning. Don't be like Gaspipe, they'd say when someone got too violent, too paranoid, too reckless. It was strange. He had spent his life becoming the most feared man in New York, and now his legacy was a cautionary tale. His name, once a weapon, had turned into a ghost story told to keep others in line. That was the irony of absolute power. It never lasts. It just changes shape. Even in death, there are people who refuse to speak about him. Old men in Brooklyn diners would shake their heads and mutter, "That guy, he was something else." They didn't mean it as praise. It was fear wrapped in exhaustion. They had seen what he did to people, friends, rivals, even his own men. They remembered the bodies, the whispers, the way people vanished overnight. He wasn't a man to them anymore. He was a shadow that had once walked among them. And yet, there were others, men who had lived through the golden age of the Mafia, who still spoke of him with a kind of grim respect. Gaspipe was a real gangster, one said. Not like these kids today with their phones and selfies. He played for keeps. It wasn't admiration, it was nostalgia. A longing for a time when the rules were clear, even if they were cruel. Casso represented the end of that era, the final act of a world built on silence and fear. But the world moved on. The Mafia changed. The code that once bound men together turned to dust under the weight of modern surveillance, technology, and greed. The FBI didn't need informants anymore. They had algorithms and wiretaps. The mob wasn't a mystery. It was a spreadsheet. The kind of men who ruled the streets in the 20th century couldn't exist in the 21st. And that's what made Casso's story so haunting. He was the last of his kind, a relic from a time when fear was currency and silence was law. In his final years, he had written letters trying to shape his legacy. He wanted people to remember him as a businessman, a strategist, not a killer. "I did what I had to do," he wrote. "Everyone did. I just did it better." But history doesn't care about excuses. His name was already set in stone, etched into the same dark mythology as names like Gotti, Gravano, and Capone. Except Casso's myth was colder. There was no glamour, no flash, no charisma. Just violence, efficient, ruthless, and unrelenting. Even now, when crime historians look back at the fall of the American Mafia, they point to two names that symbolize its end. John Gotti, the man who brought too much attention, and Anthony Casso, the man who brought too much fear. Together, They destroyed the illusion that the Mafia was a noble fraternity. They exposed it for what it had always been, a machine that eats its own. There's an old saying in the underworld: the louder a man is, the quicker he falls. Casso was proof of the opposite. He never shouted. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than gunfire. And in that silence, he built an empire. But empires built on silence eventually crumble into it. Those who worked under him never forgot the eyes, that cold, calculating stare that seemed to see right through you. Men who had killed for him, who had sworn their lives to him, spoke about those eyes like a curse. He didn't look at you, one said. He looked inside you, like he was already deciding where to bury you. That was his gift and his curse. He understood people too well. He could smell fear, taste betrayal, predict weakness. But when everyone is an enemy in your mind, even loyalty becomes a threat. That paranoia didn't die with him. It infected everyone around him. After his arrest, men turned on each other faster than ever before. It was as if his legacy of suspicion had outlived him. No one trusted anyone. The mob wars that followed tore through the remnants of old families. The structure that once kept chaos at bay was gone. Gaspipe had destroyed not just people, but the idea of order itself. Still, there's a strange fascination with him that refuses to fade. Maybe it's because he represents the raw truth of power. No charm, no honor, no excuses, just control. He was what happens when morality is stripped away and replaced with survival instinct. In his mind, he wasn't evil. He was necessary. A man doing what had to be done in a world that punished weakness. And maybe that's what makes his story so chilling, because deep down, he believed it. There's a line from one of his early interrogations that agents still quote to this day. When asked if he ever regretted the lives he took, Casso leaned forward and said, "Regret is for people who lost." That was his philosophy in one sentence. Life was war. You win, or you die. Regret was a luxury he didn't understand. But he was wrong about one thing. You can win for a while, but everyone loses in the end. In the years after his death, documentaries, books, and podcasts began revisiting his life. The fascination was undeniable. Audiences were drawn to him not out of admiration, but curiosity. How could one man wield such power through fear alone? The answer, as always, was simple. People gave it to him. They let him scare them, obeyed him, fed the myth until it became bigger than the truth. Fear, after all, only works if people believe it does. And for decades, New York believed. Today, the places he once ruled are almost unrecognizable. The clubs are gone, the storefronts changed, the men who once controlled them dead or forgotten. Bensonhurst, the neighborhood where he grew up, has moved on. Kids ride bikes past corners where deals were once made in whispers. No one remembers the faces that built their empires there. That's the final cruelty of time. It buries everything under new noise. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the city falls still and the distant hum of traffic fades, you can almost feel it, the echo of what once was. The fear that hung over the city like fog. The sound of boots on wet pavement. The chill of a phone call in the dark. Those who lived through it say it's hard to explain. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of Gaspipe. A fear that didn't need words, didn't need threats. Just his name. Maybe that's why his story still matters. Not because he was extraordinary, but because he was the inevitable result of a world built on silence. A world that rewards power and punishes doubt. Casso was its perfect creation, efficient, loyal until he wasn't, and utterly without mercy. He didn't invent fear, he refined it. And in that refinement, he showed everyone what the Mafia really was. Not family, not honor, not tradition, just survival. The Mafia had always claimed to protect its own, to stand for respect and loyalty. But when you strip away the romance, what's left are men like Gaspipe, driven by ego, haunted by paranoia, and terrified of losing control. His legacy wasn't power. It was truth. The truth that every empire of fear eventually eats itself alive. That no matter how powerful a man becomes, fear doesn't protect him. It consumes him. It isolates him until the silence he once commanded becomes his prison. Anthony Casso died alone, unseen, uncelebrated. But his name still floats in the dark corners of New York's history, a ghost story with a pulse. Because some men die, and the world forgets. Others die, and the world remembers why it's glad they're gone. Gaspipe's legacy isn't one of triumph or tragedy. It's a warning, a reminder that fear may build an empire, but it can't sustain one. That silence may protect a man, but it also erases him. That in the end, even the most feared man in New York couldn't escape the one truth that haunts all men who live by violence. Sooner or later, the silence you control becomes the silence that swallows you. And that's how it ends. Not with blood, not with glory. Just a whisper fading into the city that once trembled at his name. A silence heavy enough to carry the memory of a man who wanted to live forever and succeeded in the worst possible way.